Mr. Toots, who himself appeared to have some secret reasons for being in a nervous state, was so unspeakably disconcerted by the captain's stare that after looking at him vacantly for some time in silence and shifting uneasily on his chair, he said, "I beg your pardon, Captain Gills, but you don't happen to see anything particular in me, do you know, my lad?" returned the captain. "No, because you know," said Mr. Toots with a chuckle, "I know I'm wasting away, you needn't at all mind." Alluding to that, I should like it, Burgess and company have altered by measure. I'm in that state of thinness, it's a gratification to me, I'm glad of it. I'd a great deal rather go into a decline, if I could. I'm a mere brute, you know, grazing upon the surface of the earth." Captain Gills, the more Toots went on in this way, the more the captain was weighed down by his secret, and stared at him, what with this cause of uneasiness and his desire to get rid of Mr. Toots. The captain was in such a scared and strange condition indeed that if he had been in conversation with a ghost he could hardly have evinced greater discomposure. "But I was going to say, Captain Gillies," said Mr. Tudges, "happening to be this way early this morning, to tell you the truth, I was coming to breakfast with you. As to sleep, you know, I never sleep now. I might be a watchman, except that I don't get any pay, and he's got nothing on his mind. Carry on, my lad," said the captain in an admonitory voice. "Certainly, Captain Gillies," said Mr. Toots, "perfectly a true happening to be this way early this morning, an hour or so ago, and finding the door shut." "What were you waiting there, brother?" demanded the captain. "Not at all, Captain Gillies," returned Mr. Toots. "I didn't stop a moment. I thought you were out, but the person said, 'By the by, you don't keep a dog, do you, Captain Gills?'" The captain shook his head. "To be sure," said Mr. Toots, "that's exactly what I said. I knew you didn't. There is a dog Captain Gills connected with, but excuse me, that's forbidden's ground." The captain stared at Mr. Toots until he seemed to swell to twice his natural size, and again the perspiration broke out on the captain's forehead when he thought of Diogenes taking it into his head to come down and make a third in the parlor. "The person said," continued Mr. Toot, "that he had heard a dog barking in the shop, which I knew couldn't be, and I told him so, but he was as positive as if he had seen the dog." "What person, my lad?" inquired the captain. "Why, you see, there it is, Captain Gills," said Mr. Toots, with a perceptible increase in the nervousness of his manner. "It's not for me to say what may have taken place or what may not have taken place. Indeed, I don't know. I get mixed up with all sorts of things that I don't quite understand, and I think there's something rather weak in my head." In short, the captain nodded his own as a mark of assent. "But the person said, as we were walking away," continued Mr. Tudges, "that you knew what under existing circumstances might occur. He said might very strongly, and that if you were requested to prepare yourself, you would no doubt come prepared." "Person, my lad?" the captain repeated. "I don't know what person, I'm sure, Captain Gillies," replied Mr. Toots. "I haven't the least idea, but coming to the door I found him waiting there, and he said, was I coming back again, and I said yes, and he said, did I know you, and I said yes, I had the pleasure of your acquaintance. You had given me the pleasure of your acquaintance, after some persuasion, and he said if that was the case, would I say to you what I have said about existing circumstances and coming prepared, and as soon as ever I saw you would I ask you to step round the corner, if it was only for 1 minute, on most important business, to Mr. Brogley's the broker's. Now I tell you what, Captain Gills, whatever it is, I am convinced it's very important, and if you like to step round now, I'll wait here till you come back." The captain, divided between his fear of compromising Florence in some way by not going and his horror of leaving Mr. Toots in possession of the house with a chance of finding out the secret, was a spectacle of mental disturbance that even Mr. Toots could not be blind to. But that young gentleman, considering his nautical friend, is merely in a state of preparation for the interview he was going to have, was quite satisfied, and did not review his own discreet conduct. Without chuckles, at length the captain decided, as the lesser of two evils, to run round to Brogley's the broker's, previously locking the door that communicated with the upper part of the house and putting the key in his pocket, if so be, said the captain to Mr. Toots, with not a little shame and hesitation, "As you'll excuse my doing of it, brother Captain Gills," returned Mr. Toots. "Whatever you do is satisfactory to me." The captain thanked him heartily, and promising to come back in less than 5 minutes, went out in quest of the person who had entrusted Mr. Toots with this mysterious message. Poor Mistrust, left to himself, lay down upon the sofa, little thinking who had reclined there last, and gazing up at the skylight, and resigning himself to visions of Miss Tomboy, lost all heed of time and place. It was as well that he did so, for although the captain was not gone long, he was gone much longer than he had proposed. When he came back, he was very pale indeed, and greatly agitated, and even looked as if he had been shedding tears. He seemed to have lost the faculty of speech until he had been to the cupboard and taken a dram of rum from the case bottle, when he fetched a deep breath and sat down in a chair with his hand before his face. Captain Gills, said Toots kindly, I hope and trust there's nothing wrong. Thank the my lad, not a bit, said the captain. Quite contrary, you have the appearance of being overcome, Captain Gills observed Mr. Toots. Why, my lad, I am took aback, the captain admitted. I am. Is there anything I can do, Captain Gills, inquired Mr. Toots. If there is, make use of me. The captain removed his hand from his face, looked at him with a remarkable expression of pity and tenderness, and took him by the hand and shook it hard. No, thank the, said the captain. Nothin', only I'll take it as a favor if you'll part company for the present. I believe, brother, wringing his hand again, that after Walter, and on a different model, you're as good a lad as ever stepped, upon my word and honor. Captain Gilles returned Mr. Toots, giving the captain's hand a preliminary slap before shaking it again. It's delightful to me to possess your good opinion. Thank the, and bear a hand and cheer up, said the captain, patting him on the back. What, there's more than one sweet critter in the world. Not to me, Captain Gillies, replied Mr. Toots gravely, not to me. I assure you the state of my feelings towards Miss Dormer is of that unspeakable description that my heart is a desert island and she lives in it alone. I'm getting more used up every day, and I'm proud to be so. If you could see my legs when I take my boots off, you'd form some idea of what unrequited affection is. I have been prescribed bark, but I don't take it, for I don't wish to have any tone whatever given to my constitution. I'd rather not. This, however, is forbidden's ground. Captain Gills, goodbye. Captain Cuttle, cordially reciprocating the warmth of Mr. Toots's farewell, locked the door behind him, and shaking his head with the same remarkable expression of pity and tenderness as he had regarded him with before, went up to see if Florence wanted him. There was an entire change in the captain's face as he went upstairs. He wiped his eyes with his handkerchief, and he polished the bridge of his nose with his sleeve as he had done already that morning. But his face was absolutely changed now. He might have been thought supremely happy, now he might have been thought sad. But the kind of gravity that sat upon his features was quite new to them, and was as great an improvement to them as if they had undergone some sublimating process. He knocked softly with his hook at Florence's door twice or thrice, but receiving no answer, ventured first to peep in, and then to enter, emboldened to take the latter step perhaps by the familiar recognition of Diogenes, who stretched upon the ground by the side of her couch, wagged his tail, and winked his eyes at the captain without being at the trouble of getting up. She was sleeping heavily and moaning in her sleep, and Captain Cuttle, with a perfect awe of her youth and beauty and her sorrow, raised her head and adjusted the coat that covered her where it had fallen, often darkened the window a little more that she might sleep on, and crept out again and took his post of watch upon the stairs. All this with a touch and tread as light as Florence's own. Long may it remain in this mixed world a point not easy of decision, which is the more beautiful evidence of the Almighty's goodness, the delicate fingers that are formed for sensitiveness and sympathy of touch, and made to minister to pain and grief, or the rough hard Captain Cuttle hand that the heart teaches, guides, and softens. In a moment Florence slept upon her couch, forgetful of her homelessness and orphanage, and Captain Cuttle watched upon the stairs. A louder sob or moan than usual brought him sometimes to her door, but by degrees she slept more peacefully, and the captain's watch was undisturbed. Chapter 49. The midshipman makes a discovery. It was long before Florence awoke. The day was in its prime, the day was in its wane, and still uneasy in mind and body, she slept on, unconscious of her strange bed, of the noise and turmoil in the street, and of the light that shone outside the shaded window, perfect unconsciousness of what had happened in the home that existed no more, even the deep slumber of exhaustion could not produce some undefined and mournful recollection of it, dozing uneasily, but never sleeping pervaded all her rest. A dull sorrow, like a half-lulled sense of pain, was always present to her, and her pale cheek was oftener wet with tears than the honest captain, softly putting in his head from time to time at the half-closed door, could have desired to see it. The sun was getting low in the west and glancing out of a red mist pierced with its rays opposite loopholes and pieces of fretwork in the spires of city churches, as if with golden arrows that struck through and through them, and far away athwart the river and its flat banks it was gleaming like a path of fire, and out at sea it was irradiating sails of ships, and looked towards from quiet churchyards upon hilltops in the country. It was steeping distant prospects in a flush and glow that seemed to mingle earth and sky together in one glorious suffusion, when Florence, opening her heavy eyes, lay at first looking without interest or recognition at the unfamiliar walls around her, and listening in the same careless manner to the noises in the street. But presently she started up upon her couch, gazed round with a surprised and vacant look, and recollected. "All my pretty," said the captain, knocking at the door. "Watch your dear friend," cried Florence, hurrying to him. "Is it you?" The captain felt so much pride in the name, and was so pleased by the gleam of pleasure in her face when she saw him, that he kissed his hook by way of reply in speechless gratification. "What cheer, bright diamond," said the captain. "I have surely slept very long," returned Florence. "When did I come here? Yesterday." "This your blessed day, my lady," Lars replied the captain. "Has there been no night?" "Is it still day?" asked Florence, getting on for evening now, my pretty," said the captain, drawing back the curtain of the window. "See Florence," with her hand upon the captain's arm, so sorrowful and timid, and the captain, with his rough face and burly figure so quietly protective of her, stood in the rosy light of the bright evening sky without saying a word, however strange the form of speech into which he might have fashioned the feeling if he had had to give it utterance. The captain felt as sensibly as the most eloquent of men could have done that there was something in the tranquil time and its softened beauty that would make the wounded heart of Florence overflow, and it was better that such tears should have their way. So not a word spake Captain Cuttle, but when he felt his arm clasped closer, and when he felt the lonely head come nearer to it and lay itself against his homely coarse blue sleeve, he pressed it gently with his rugged hand and understood it, and was understood better. "Now, my pretty," said the captain cheerily, "I'll go down below and get some dinner ready. Will you come down of your own self afterwards, pretty, or shall Edward Cuttle come and fetch you?" As Florence assured him that she was quite able to walk downstairs, the captain, though evidently doubtful of his own hospitality in permitting it, left her to do so, and immediately set about roasting a fowl at the fire in the little parlor. To achieve his cookery with the greater skill, he pulled off his coat, tucked up his wristbands, and put on his glazed hat, without which assistant he never applied himself to any nice or difficult undertaking. After cooling her aching head and burning face in the fresh water which the captain's care had provided for her while she slept, Florence went to the little mirror to bind up her disordered hair. Then she knew in a moment, for she shunned it instantly, that on her breast there was the darkening mark of an angry hand. Her tears burst forth afresh at the sight. She was ashamed and afraid of it, but it moved her to no anger against him. Homeless and fatherless, she forgave him everything, hardly thought that she had need to forgive him, or that she did, but she fled from the idea of him as she had fled from the reality, and he was utterly gone and lost. There was no such being in the world. What to do or where to live, Florence, poor inexperienced girl, could not yet consider. She had indistinct dreams of finding a long way off some little sisters to instruct, who would be gentle with her, and to whom under some feigned name she might attach herself, and who would grow up in their happy home and marry, and be good to their old governess, and perhaps in time entrust her in time with the education of their own daughters. And she thought how strange and sorrowful it would be thus to become a gray-haired woman, carrying her secret to the grave when Florence Dombey was forgotten. But it was all dim and clouded to her now. She only knew that she had no father upon earth, and she said so many times, with her suppliant head hidden from all but her Father who was in heaven, her little stock of money amounted to but a few guineas with a part of this, it would be necessary to buy some clothes, for she had none, but those she wore she was too desolate. To think how soon her money would be gone, too much a child in worldly matters to be greatly troubled on that score. Yet even if her other trouble had been less, she tried to calm her thoughts and stay her tears to quiet the hurry in her throbbing head and bring herself to believe that what had happened to her, but the events of a few hours ago, instead of weeks or months as they appeared, and went down to her kind protector. The captain had spread the cloth with great care and was making some egg sauce in a little saucepan, basting the fowl from time to time during the process with a strong interest as it turned and browned on a string before the fire, having propped Florence up with cushions on the sofa, which was already wheeled into a warm corner for her greater comfort. The captain pursued his cooking with extraordinary skill, making hot gravy in a second little saucepan, boiling a handful of potatoes in a third, never forgetting the egg sauce in the first, and making an impartial round of basting and stirring with the most useful of spoons every minute. Besides these cares, the captain had to keep his eye on a diminutive frying pan in which some sausages were hissing and bubbling in a most musical manner, and there was never such a radiant cook as the captain looked in the height and heat of these functions, it being impossible to say whether his face or his glazed hat shone the brighter, the dinner being at length quite ready. Captain Cuttle dished and served it up with no less dexterity than he had cooked it. He then dressed for dinner by taking off his glazed hat and putting on his coat. That done, he wheeled the table close against Florence on the sofa, said grace, unscrewed his hook, screwed his fork into its place, and did the honors of the table. My lady lass, said the captain, cheer up and try to eat a deal. Stand by my dearie liver wing. It is sauce, it is sausage, it is, and potato, all which the captain ranged symmetrically on a plate, and pouring hot gravy on the whole with a useful spoon, set before his cherished guest. The whole row of deadlights is up forward, lady lass, observed the captain encouragingly, and everything is made snug. Try and pick a bit, my pretty. If Waller was here, ah, if I had him for my brother now, cried Florence. Don't take on my pretty, said the captain, a wasp to oblige me. He was your natural born friend, like Wandy pet. Florence had no other words to answer with. She only said, oh dear, dear Paul. Oh Walter, the weary plank she walked on, murmured the captain, looking at her drooping face, was as high as steamed by water as the water brooks is by the heart which never rejoices. I see him now the weary day he was rated on that Dumby books, speaking of her with his face a glancing with due leastways, with his modest sentiments, like a new blowed rose at dinner. Well, if our poor Walla was here, my lady lass, or if he could be, for he's drownded, ain't he? Florence shook her head. Yes, grounded, said the captain soothingly. As I was saying, if he could be here, he'd beg and pray of you, my precious, to pick a little bit with a lookout for your own sweet health, whereby hold your own, my lady lass, as if it was for Waller's sake, and lay your pretty head to the wind. Florence is said to eat a morsel for the captain's pleasure. The captain, meanwhile, who seemed to have quite forgotten his own dinner, laid down his knife and fork and drew his chair to the sofa. Warner was a trim lad, whiny precious, said the captain, after sitting for some time silently rubbing his chin with his eyes fixed upon her, and a brave lad and a good lad. Florence tearfully assented. And he's drownded, beauty, any, said the captain in a soothing voice. Florence could not but assent again. He was older than you, my lady lass, pursued the captain, but you was like two children together at first, won't you? Florence answered yes. And Waller's drownded, said the captain. Amy, the repetition of this inquiry was a curious source of consolation, but it seemed to be one to Captain Cuttle, for he came back to it again and again. Florence feigned to push from her untasted dinner, and to lie back on her sofa, gave him her hand, feeling that she had disappointed him, though truly wishing to have pleased him after all his trouble. But he held it in his own, which shook as he held it, and appearing to have quite forgotten all about the dinner and her want of appetite, went on growling at intervals in a ruminating tone of sympathy. Poor Waller, I drownded, and always waited for her answer, in which the great point of these singular reflections appeared to consist. The fowl and sausages were cold, and the gravy and egg sauce stagnant, before the captain remembered that they were on the board, and fell to with the assistance of Diogenes, whose united efforts quickly dispatch the banquet the captain's delight, and wonder at the quiet housewifery of Florence in assisting to clear the table, arrange the parlor, and sweep up the hearth, only to be equaled by the fervency of his protest when she began to assist him, were gradually raised to that degree that at last he could not choose but to do nothing himself and stand looking at her as if she was some fairy daintily performing these offices for him, the red rim on his forehead glowing again in his unspeakable admiration. But when Florence, taking down his pipe from the mantel shelf, gave it into his hand and entreated him to smoke it, the good captain was so bewildered by her attention that he held it as if he had never held a pipe in all his life. Likewise, when Florence, looking into the little cupboard, took out the case bottle and mixed a perfect glass of grog for him unasked and set it at his elbow, his ruddy nose turned pale. He felt himself so graced and honored when he had filled his pipe in an absolute reverie of satisfaction. Florence lighted it for him, the captain having no power to object or to prevent her, and resuming her place on the old sofa, looked at him with a smile so loving and so grateful, a smile that showed him so plainly how her forlorn heart turned to him as her face did through grief, that the smoke of the pipe got into the captain's throat and made him cough, and got into the captain's eyes and made them blink and water. The manner in which the captain tried to make believe that the cause of these effects lay hidden in the pipe itself, and the way in which he looked into the bowl for it, and not finding it there, pretended to blow it out of the stem, was wonderfully pleasant. The pipe soon getting into better condition, he fell into that state of repose, becoming a good smoker, but sat with his eyes fixed on Florence, and with a beaming placidity not to be described, and stopping every now and then to discharge a little cloud from his lips, slowly puffed it forth as if it were a scroll coming out of his mouth bearing the legend "Por Waller I Drowniina," after which he would resume his smoking with infinite gentleness, unlike as they were externally, and there could scarcely be a more decided contrast between Florence in her delicate youth and beauty, and Captain Cuttle with his knobby face, his great broad weather-beaten person, and his gruff voice and simple innocence of the world's ways and the world's perplexities and dangers. They were nearly on a level. No child could have surpassed Captain Cuttle in inexperience of everything but wind and weather, in simplicity, credulity, and generous trustfulness. Faith, hope, and charity shared his whole nature among them. An odd sort of romance, perfectly unimaginative, yet perfectly unreal and subject to no considerations of worldly prudence or practicability, was the only partner they had in his character. As the captain sat and smoked and looked at Florence, God knows what impossible pictures in which she was the principal figure presented themselves to his mind. Equally vague and uncertain, though not so sanguine, were her own thoughts of the life before her, and even as her tears made prismatic colors in the light she gazed at, so through her new and heavy grief she already saw a rainbow faintly shining in the far-off sky, a wandering princess. And a good monster in a storybook might have sat by the fireside and talked as Captain Cuttle and poor Florence talked, and not have looked very much unlike them. The captain was not troubled with the faintest idea of any difficulty in retaining Florence, or of any responsibility thereby incurred. Having put up the shutters and locked the door, he was quite satisfied on this head. If she had been a ward in Chancery, it would have made no difference at all to Captain Cuttle. He was the last man in the world to be troubled by any such considerations, so the captain smoked his pipe very comfortably in Florence, and he meditated after their own manner. When the pipe was out, they had some tea, and then Florence entreated him to take her to some neighboring shop where she could buy the few necessaries she immediately wanted. It being quite dark, the captain consented, peeping carefully out first, as he had been wont to do in his time of hiding from Mrs. McStinger, and arming himself with a large stick in case of an appeal to arms being rendered necessary by any unforeseen circumstance. The pride Captain Cuttle had in giving his arm to Florence and escorting her some 200 or 300 yards, keeping a bright lookout all the time and attracting the attention of everyone who passed them by his great vigilance and numerous precautions, was extreme. Arrived at the shop, the captain felt it a point of delicacy to retire during the making of the purchases, as they were to consist of wearing apparel, but he previously deposited his tin canister on the counter and informing the young lady of the establishment that it contained 14 pounds to requested her in case that amount of property should not be sufficient to defray the expenses of his niece's little outfit. At the word niece, he bestowed a most significant look on Florence, accompanied with pantomime expressive of sagacity and mystery to have the goodness to sing out, and he would make up the difference from his pocket, casually consulting his big watch as a deep means of dazzling the establishment and impressing it with a sense of property. The captain then kissed his hook to his niece and retired outside the window, where it was a choice sight to see his great face looking in from time to time among the silks and ribbons, with an obvious misgiving that Florence had been spirited away by a back door. "Dear Captain Cuttle," said Florence, when she came out with a parcel the size of which greatly disappointed the captain, who had expected to see a porter following with a bale of goods. "I don't want this money, indeed. I have not spent any of it. I have money of my own, my lady lass," returned the baffled captain, looking straight down the street before them. "Take care on it for me, will you be so good? Till such time as I ask for it, may I put it back in its usual place," said Florence, "and keep it there." The captain was not at all gratified by this proposal, but he answered, I put it anywhere as my lady lass, so long as you know where to find it again. It ain't a no use to me," said the captain. "I wonder I hadn't chucked it away afore now." The captain was quite disheartened for the moment, but he revived at the first touch of Florence's arm, and they returned with the same precautions as they had come, the captain opening the door of the little midshipman's berth and diving in with a suddenness which his great practice only could have taught him. During Florence's slumber in the morning, he had engaged the daughter of an elderly lady who usually sat under a blue umbrella in Leadenhall Market selling poultry to come and put her room in order and render her any little services she required, and this damsel now appearing, Florence found everything about her as convenient and orderly, if not as handsome as in the terrible dream she had once called home. When they were alone again, the captain insisted on her eating a slice of dried toast and drinking a glass of spiced negus, which he made to perfection, and encouraging her with every kind word and inconsequential quotation he could possibly think of, led her upstairs to her bedroom. But he had something on his mind, and was not easy in his manner. "Good night, dear heart," said Captain Cuttle to her at her chamber door. Florence raised her lips to his face and kissed him. At any other time the captain would have been overbalanced by such a token of her affection and gratitude, but now, although he was very sensible of it, he looked in her face with even more uneasiness than he had testified before, and seemed unwilling to leave her. "Poor Waller," said the captain. Poor Walter," sighed Florence. "Drowned." "It ain't," said the captain. Florence shook her head and sighed. "Good night, my lady lass," said Captain Cuttle, putting out his hand. "God bless you, dear kind friend." But the captain lingered still. "Is anything the matter, dear Captain Cuttle?" said Florence, easily alarmed in her then state of mind. "Have you anything to tell me?" "To tell you, lady lass," replied the captain, meeting her eyes in confusion. No, what should I have to tell you, pretty? You don't expect as I've got anything good to tell you?" "Sure no," said Florence, shaking her head. The captain looked at her wistfully and repeated no, still lingering and still showing embarrassment. "Poor Waller," said the captain. "My Waller, as I used to call you, old Saul Giles's nevy. Welcome to all as new as the flowers in May. Where are you got to, brave boy? Drowned, ain't he?" concluding his apostrophe with this abrupt appeal to Florence. The captain bade her good night and descended the stairs, while Florence remained at the top holding the candle out to light him down. He was lost in the obscurity, and judging from the sound of his receding footsteps, was in the act of turning into the little parlor, when his head and shoulders unexpectedly emerged again as from the deep, apparently for no other purpose than to repeat, "Roundhead, ain't he pretty?" For when he had said that in a tone of tender condolence, he disappeared. Florence was very sorry that she should unwittingly, though naturally, have awakened these associations in the mind of her protector by taking refuge there and sitting down before the little table where the captain had arranged the telescope and song book and those other rarities, thought of Walter and of all that was connected with him in the past, until she could have almost wished to lie down on her bed and fade away. But in her lonely yearning to the dead, whom she had loved, no thought of home no possibility of going back, no presentation of it as yet existing, or as sheltering her father once entered her thoughts. She had seen the murder done in the last lingering natural aspect in which she had cherished him through so much he had been torn out of her heart, defaced, and slain. The thought of it was so appalling to her that she covered her eyes and shrunk, trembling from the least remembrance of the deed or of the cruel hand that if her fond heart could have held his image after that it must have broken, but it could not, and the void was filled with a wild dread that fled from all confronting with its shattered fragments, with such a dread as could have risen out of nothing but the depths of such a love so wrong. She dared not look into the glass, for the sight of the darkening mark upon her bosom made her afraid of herself. As if she bore about her something wicked, she covered it up with a hasty faltering hand, and in the dark, and laid her weary head down weeping. The captain did not go to bed for a long time. He walked to and fro in the shop and in the little parlor for a full hour, and appearing to have composed himself by that exercise, sat down with a grave and thoughtful face and read out of a prayer book the forms of prayer appointed to be used at sea. These were not easily disposed of, the good captain being a mighty slow, gruff reader, and frequently stopping at a hard word to give himself such encouragement as, "No, my lad, with a will, or steady, I don't cuddle steady," which had a great effect in helping him out of any difficulty. Moreover, his spectacles greatly interfered with his powers of vision. But notwithstanding these drawbacks, the captain, being heartily in earnest, read the service to the very last line, and with genuine feeling too, and approving of it very much, when he had done, turned and under the counter, but not before he had been upstairs, and listened at Florence's door with a serene breast and a most benevolent visage. The captain turned out several times in the course of the night to assure himself that his charge was resting quietly, and once at daybreak found that she was awake, for she called to know if it were he. On hearing footsteps near her door, "Yes, my lady lass," replied the captain in a growling whisper. "Are you all right, Diamond?" Florence thanked him and said yes. The captain could not lose so favorable an opportunity of applying his mouth to the keyhole and calling through it like a horse breeze. Horwaller drowned at any, after which he withdrew, and turning in again slept till 7 o'clock. Nor was he free from his uneasy and embarrassed manner all that day, though Florence, being busy with her needle in the little parlor, was more calm and tranquil than she had been on the day preceding. Almost always, when she raised her eyes from her work, she observed the captain looking at her and thoughtfully stroking his chin, and he so often hitched his armchair close to her as if he were going to say something very confidential, and hitched it away again, as not being able to make up his mind how to begin that. In the course of the day he cruised completely round the parlor in that frail bark, and more than once went ashore against the wainscot or the closet door in a very distressed condition. It was not until twilight that Captain Cuddlefairly, dropping anchor at last by the side of Florence, began to talk at all connectedly. But when the light of the fire was shining on the walls and ceiling of the little room, and on the tea-board and the cups and saucers that were ranged upon the table, and on her calm face turned towards the flame, and reflecting it in the tears that filled her eyes, the captain broke a long silence. "Thus you never was at sea, my own?" "No," replied Florence. "I," said the captain reverently, "it's a almighty element. There's wonders in the deep, my pretty, think on it. When the winds is roaring, and the waves is rolling, think on it. When the stormy nights is so pitch dark," said the captain solemnly, holding up his hook, "as you can see your hand afore you, excepting when the wicked lightning reveals the same, and when you drive through the storm and dark, as if you was a driven head-on to the world without end evermore, amen. And when found making a note of them's the times, my beauty, when a man may say to his messmate previously our overhaul, and of the volume a stiff nor'wester's blowing bell, hark, don't you hear it roar now? Lord help him, how I pities all unhappy folks ashore now," which quotation, as particularly applicable to the terrors of the ocean, the captain delivered in a most impressive manner, concluding with a sonorous "Standboy, were you ever in a dreadful storm?" asked Florence. "Why, my lady lass, I've seen my share of bad weather," said the captain, tremulously wiping his head, "and I've had my share of knocking about, But it ain't of myself I was a meaning to speak. Our dear boy drawing closer to her, Waller darling, as was drowned captain spoke in such a trembling voice, and looked at Florence with a face so pale and agitated that she clung to his hand in a fright. Your face has changed, cried Florence. You are altered in a moment. What is it, dear captain? Cuddle. It turns me cold to see you. What, lady lass, returned the captain, supporting her with his hand. Don't be took aback. No, all's well, my dear. As I was a-saying, Waller, he's drowned, it ain't. Florence looked at him intently. Her color came and went, and she laid her hand upon her breast. There's perils and dangers on the deep, my beauty, and over many a brave ship and many a bold heart the secret waters has closed up and never told no tales. But there's escapes upon the deep too, and sometimes one man out of a score, maybe out of 100 pretty, has been saved by the mercy of God and come home after being given over for dead and told of all hands lost. I know a story, heart's delight, stammered the captain. Oh, this nater, as was told to me once, and being on this your attack, and you and me sitting alone by the fire, maybe you'd like to hear me tell it, would you, dearie? Florence, trembling with an agitation which he could not control or understand, involuntarily followed his glance, which went behind her into the shop where a lamp was burning. The instant that she turned her head, the captain sprang out of his chair and interposed his hand. There is nothing there, my beauty, said the captain. Don't look there. Why not? asked Florence. The captain murmured something about its being dull that way, and about the fire being cheerful. He drew the door ajar, which had been standing open until now, and resumed his seat. Florence followed him with her eyes, and looked intently in his face. The story was about a ship, my lady lass began. The captain has sailed out of the port of London, with a fair wind and in fair weather, bound for, don't be took aback, my lady lass. She was only out of bound, pretty, only out of bound. The expression on Florence's face alarmed the captain, who was himself very hot and flurried, and showed scarcely less agitation than she did. Shall I go on, beauty? said the captain. Yes, pray, cried Florence. The captain made a gulp as if to get down something that was sticking in his throat, and nervously proceeded that their unfortunate ship met with such foul weather out at sea as don't blow once in 20 year, my darling. There were hurricanes ashore as tore up forests and blew down towns, and there were gales at sea in them latitudes as not the sturdiest vessel ever launched could live in. They are today that their unfortunate ship behaved noble, I'm told, and did her duty brave, my pretty, but had one blow amost her bullocks, was stove in her masts, and rudder carved away, her best man swept overboard, and she left to the mercy of the storm, as had no mercy, but blew harder and harder yet, while the waves dashed over her and beat her in, and every time they come a thundering at her, broke her like a shell. Every black spot in every mountain of water that rolled away, it was a bit of the ship's life for a living man, and so she went to pieces, beauty, and no grass will never grow upon the graves of them as man that ship. They were not all lost, cried Florence. Some were saved. Was one aboard of that their unfortunate vessel, said the captain, rising from his chair and clenching his hand with prodigious energy and exultation. Was a lad, a gallant lad, as I've heard tell, that had loved when he was a boy to read and talk about brave actions and shipwrecks. I've heard him, and he remembered of them in his hour of need, when the stoutest and oldest hands was hove down. He was firm and cheery. It wasn't the want of objects to like and love ashore that gave him courage, it was his natural mind. I've seen it in his face when he was no more than a child, many a time, and when I thought it nothing but his good looks, bless him. And was he saved, cried Florence. Was he saved, that brave lad, said the captain. Look at me, pretty, don't look round. Florence had hardly power to repeat, why not? Because there's nothing there, my dearie, said the captain. Don't be took aback, pretty critter. Don't, for the sake of Waller, as was dear to all on us, that there, lad, said the captain. I had her working with the best and standing by the faint-hearted and never making no complaint nor sign of fear, and keeping up a spirit in all hands that made him honor him as if he had been a admiral. That lad, along with the second mate and one seaman, was left of all the beaten hearts that went aboard that ship, the only living creatures lashed to a fragment of the wreck and drifting on the stormy sea where they saved, cried Florence. Days and nights they drifted on them endless waters, said the captain, until at last no don't look that way pretty a sail bore down upon them, and they was by the Lord's mercy took aboard to living, and one dead, which of them was dead, cried Florence, not the lad I speak on. Said the captain, thank God, oh thank God. Hey man, returned the captain hurriedly, don't be took aback a minute more, my lady lass, with a good heart aboard that ship. He went a long voyage right away across the chart, for there weren't no touching nowhere, and on that voyage the seaman as was picked up with him died, but he was spared, and the captain, without knowing what he did, had cut a slice of bread from the loaf and put it on his hook, which was his usual toasting fork, on which he now held it to the fire, looking behind Florence with great emotion in his face and suffering. The bread to blaze and burn like fuel was spared, repeated Florence, and then come home in that ship, said the captain, still looking in the same direction, and don't be froid and pretty, and landed, and one morning come cautiously to his own door to take a observation, knowing that his friends would think him drowned, when he sheered off at the unexpected barking of a dog. Cried Florence quickly. Yes, roared the captain, steady down, courage, don't look round yet. See there upon the wall, there was the shadow of a man upon the wall close to her. She started up, looked round, and with a piercing cry saw Walter Gay behind her. She had no thought of him, but as a brother rescued from the grave, a shipwrecked brother saved, and at her side, and rushed into his arms, and all the world he seemed to be her hope, her comfort, refuge, natural protector. Take care of Walter, I was fond of Walter. The dear remembrance of the plaintive voice that said so rushed upon her soul like music in the night. Oh, welcome home, dear Walter, welcome to the stricken breast. She felt the words, although she could not utter them, and held him in her pure embrace. Captain Cuttle, in a fit of delirium, attempted to wipe his head with the blackened toast upon his hook, and finding it an uncongenial substance for the purpose, put it into the crown of his glazed hat, put the glazed hat on, with some difficulty essayed to sing a verse of Lovely Peg, broke down at the first word, and retired into the shop, whence he presently came back express, with a face all flushed and besmeared, and the stars completely taken out of his shirt collar, to say these words, Water, my lad, here is a little bit of property as I should wish to make over jointly. The captain hastily produced the big watch, the teaspoons, the sugar tongs, and the canister, and laying them on the table, swept them with his great hand into Walter's hat. But in handing that singular strong box to Walter, he was so overcome again that he was fain to make another retreat into the shop, and absented himself for a longer space of time than on his first retirement. But Walter sought him out and brought him back. And then the captain's great apprehension was that Florence would suffer from this new shock. He felt it so earnestly that he turned quite rational, and positively interdicted any further allusion to Walter's adventures for some days to come. Captain Cuttle then became sufficiently composed to relieve himself of the toast in his hat, and to take his place at the tea board, but finding Walter's grasp upon his shoulder on one side, and Florence whispering her tearful congratulations on the other, the captain suddenly bolted again, and was missing for a good 10 minutes. But never in all his life had the captain's face so shone and glistened as when at last he sat stationary at the tea board, looking from Florence to Walter, and from Walter to Florence. Nor was this effect produced or at all heightened by the immense quantity of polishing he had administered to his face with his coat sleeve during the last half hour. It was solely the effect of his internal emotions. There was a glory and delight within the captain that spread itself over his whole visage, and made a perfect illumination there. The pride with which the captain looked upon the bronzed cheek, and the courageous eyes of his recovered boy, with which he saw the generous fervor of his youth, and all its frank and hopeful qualities shining once more in the fresh, wholesome manner, and the ardent face would have kindled something of this light in his countenance. The admiration and sympathy with which he turned his eyes on Florence, whose beauty, grace, and innocence could have won no truer or more zealous champion than himself, would have had an equal influence upon him. But the fullness of the glow he shed around him could only have been engendered in his contemplation of the two together, and in all the fancies springing out of that association that came sparkling and beaming into his head and danced about it. How they talked of poor old Uncle Sol, and dwelt on every little circumstance relating to his disappearance, how their joy was moderated by the old man's absence, and by the misfortunes of Florence, how they released Diogenes, whom the captain had decoyed upstairs some time, before lest he should bark again the captain, though he was in one continual flutter, and made many more short plunges into the shop fully comprehended. But he no more dreamed that Walter looked on Florence, as it were, from a new and far-off place, that while his eyes often sought the lovely face, they seldom met its open glance of sisterly affection, but withdrew themselves when hers were raised towards him. Then he believed that it was Walter's ghost who sat beside him. He saw them together in their youth and beauty, and he knew the story of their younger days, and he had no inch of room beneath his great blue waistcoat for anything save admiration of such a pair and gratitude for their being. Reunited they sat thus until it grew late. The captain would have been content to sit so for a week, but Walter rose to take leave for the night. Going, Walter, said Florence, where he slings his hammock for the present. Lady lass, said Captain, cuddle round of Brogley's with inhale heart's delight. I am the cords of your going away, Walter, said Florence. There is a houseless sister in your place, dear Miss Tomboy, replied Walter, hesitating. If it is not too bold to call you so, Walter, she exclaimed, surprised. If anything could make me happier in being allowed to see and speak to you, would it not be the discovery that I had any means on earth of doing you a moment's service? Where would I not go? What would I not do for your sake? She smiled and called him brother. You are so changed, said Walter. I changed, she interrupted. To me, said Walter softly, as if he were thinking aloud. Changed to me? I left you such a child, and find you, oh, something so different. But your sister, Walter, you have not forgotten what we promised to each other when we parted. Forgotten? But he said no more. And if you had, if suffering and danger had driven it from your thoughts, which it has not, you would remember it now, Walter, when you find me poor and abandoned, with no home but this, and no friends but the two who hear me speak. I would, heaven knows, I would, said Walter. Oh, Walter, exclaimed Florence through her sobs and tears, dear brother, show me some way through the world, some humble path that I may take alone and labor in, and sometimes think of you as one who will protect and care for me as for a sister. Oh, help me, Walter, for I need help so much. Miss Dobby, Florence, I would die to help you, but your friends are proud and rich. Your father, no, no, Walter, she shrieked, and put her hands up to her head in an attitude of terror that transfixed him where he stood. Don't say that word. He never from that hour forgot the voice and look with which he stopped him at the name. He felt that if he were to live 100 years, he could never forget it. Somewhere, anywhere, but never home. All past, all gone, all lost and broken up. The whole history of her untold slight and suffering was in the cry and look, and he felt he never could forget it, and he never did. She laid her gentle face upon the captain's shoulder and related how and why she had fled. If every sorrowing tear she shed in doing so had been a curse upon the head of him she never named or blamed, it would have been better for him, Walter thought, with all that to be renounced out of such a strength, and might have loved their precious, said the captain, when she ceased, and deep attention the captain had paid to her while she spoke, listening with his glazed head all awry, and his mouth wide open. I asked my eyes, Waller, day lead cheer off for tonight, and leave the pretty one to me. Walter took her hand in both of his and put it to his lips, and kissed it. He knew now that she was indeed a homeless wandering fugitive, but richer to him. So then, in all the wealth and pride of her right station, she seemed farther off than even on the height that had made him giddy in his boyish dreams. Captain Cuddle, perplexed by no such meditations, guarded Florence to her room, and watched the din devils upon the charmed ground outside her door, for such it truly was to him, until he felt sufficiently easy in his mind about her to turn in under the counter on abandoning his watch for that purpose. He could not help calling once rapturously through the keyhole, drowned, it ain't pretty, or when he got downstairs, making another trial at that verse of Lovely Peg, but it stuck in his throat somehow, and he could make nothing of it. So he went to bed, and dreamed that old Sol Gills was married to Mrs. McStinger, and kept prisoner by that lady in a secret chamber on a short allowance of victuals. Chapter 50. Mr. Toots's complaint there was an empty room above stairs at the wooden midshipman's, which in days of yore had been Walter's bedroom, Walter, rousing up the captain betimes in the morning, proposed that they should carry thither such furniture out of the little parlor as would grace it best, so that Florence might take possession of it when she rose, as nothing could be more agreeable to Captain Cuttle than making himself very red and short of breath in such a cause. He turned to, as he himself said, with a will, and in a couple of hours this garret was transformed into a species of land cabin adorned with all the choicest movables out of the parlor, inclusive even of the Tartar frigate, which the captain hung up over the chimney piece with such extreme delight that he could do nothing for half an hour afterwards but walk backward from it, lost in admiration. The captain could be induced by no persuasion of Walter's to wind up the big watch, or to take back the canister, or to touch the sugar tongs and teaspoons. No, 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 my lad, was the captain's invariable reply to any solicitation of the kind. I've made that their little property over gaily. These words he repeated with great unction and gravity, evidently believing that they had the virtue of an Act of Parliament, and that unless he committed himself by some new admission of ownership, no flaw could be found in such a form of conveyance. It was an advantage of the new arrangement that, besides the great seclusion it afforded Florence, it admitted of the midshipman being restored to his usual post of observation, and also of the shop shutters being taken down. The latter ceremony, however little importance the unconscious captain attached to it, was not wholly superfluous, for on the previous day so much excitement had been occasioned in the neighborhood by the shutters remaining unopened that the instrument maker's house had been honored with an unusual share of public observation, and had been intently stared at from the opposite side of the way by groups of hungry gazers at any time between sunrise and sunset. The idlers and vagabonds had been particularly interested in the captain's fate, constantly groveling in the mud to apply their eyes to the sagre grating under the shop window, and delighting their imaginations with the fancy that they could see a piece of his coat as he hung in a corner, though this settlement of him was stoutly disputed by an opposite faction, who are of opinion that he lay murdered with a hammer on the stairs. It was not without exciting some discontent, therefore, that the subject of these rumors was seen early in the morning, standing at his shop door as holly and hearty as if nothing had happened, and the beadle of that quarter, a man of an ambitious character, who had expected to have the distinction of being present at the breaking open of the door, and of giving evidence in full uniform before the coroner, went so far as to say to an opposite neighbor that the chap in the glazed hat had better not try it on there, without more particularly mentioning what, and further that he, the beadle, would keep his eye upon him. Captain Cuttle, said Walter, musing, when they stood resting from their labors at the shop door, looking down the old familiar street, it being still early in the morning. Nothing at all of Uncle Saul in all that time. Nothing at all, my lad, replied the captain, shaking his head. Gone in search of me, dear kind old man, said Walter. He had never written to you. But why not? He says in effect in this packet that you gave me, taking the paper from his pocket, which had been opened in the presence of the enlightened Bunsby, that if you never hear from him before opening it, you may believe him dead. Heaven forbid, but you would have heard of him even if he were dead. Simon would have written surely by his desire if he could not, and have said, on such a day there died in my house or under my care, or so forth, Mr. Solomon Gills of London, who left this last remembrance and this last request to you. The captain, who had never climbed to such a clear height of probability before, was greatly impressed by the wide prospect it opened, and answered with a thoughtful shake of his head, well said, my lad, very well said. I have been thinking of this, or at least, said Walter, coloring, I have been thinking of one thing and another all through a sleepless night, and I cannot believe, Captain Cuttle, but that my Uncle Saul, Lord bless him, is alive and will return. I don't so much wonder it is going away, because leaving out of consideration that spice of the marvelous which was always in his character, and his great affection for me, before which every other consideration of his life became nothing, as no one ought to know so well as I, who had the best of fathers in him. Walter's voice was indistinct and husky here, and he looked away along the street, leaving that out of consideration. I say, I have often read and heard of people who, having some near and dear relative who was supposed to be shipwrecked at sea, have gone down to live on that part of the seashore, where any tidings of the missing ship might be expected to arrive, though only an hour or two sooner than elsewhere, or have even gone upon her track to the place whither she was bound. As, if their going would create intelligence, I think I should do such a thing myself as soon as another, or sooner than many perhaps. But why my uncle shouldn't write to you when he so clearly intended to do so, or how he should die abroad, and you not know it through some other hand, I cannot make out. Captain Cuttle observed with a shake of his head that Jack Bunsby himself hadn't made it out, and that he was a man as could give a pretty taut opinion to, if my uncle had been a heedless young man likely to be entrapped by jovial company to some drinking place, where he was to be got rid of for the sake of what money he might have about him, said Walter, or if he had been a reckless sailor going ashore with 2 or 3 months' pay in his pocket, I could understand his disappearing and leaving no trace behind. But being what he was, and as I hope I can't believe it, Walter, my lad, inquired the captain, wistfully eyeing him as he pondered and pondered. What do you make of it then, Captain Cuttle? Returned Walter. I don't know what to make of it. I suppose he never has written. There is no doubt about that, if so be as Sal Gales wrote, my lad, replied the captain argumentatively. Where's his dispatch? Say that he entrusted it to some private hand, suggested Walter, and that it has been forgotten or carelessly thrown aside or lost even. That is more probable to me than the other event. In short, I not only cannot bear to contemplate that other event, Captain Cuttle, but I can't and won't hope you see. Weller, said the captain sagely, hope it's that as animates you hope as a boy, for which you overhaul your little warbler sentimental division. But Lord, my lad, like any other boy, it only floats, it can't be steered nowhere along with a figurehead of hope, said the captain. There's an anchor, but what's the good of my having an anchor if I can't find no bottom to let it go in? Captain Cuttle said this rather in his character of a sagacious citizen and householder bound to impart a morsel from his stores of wisdom to an inexperienced youth than in his own proper person. Indeed, his face was quite luminous as he spoke with new hope caught from Walter, and he appropriately concluded by slapping him on the back and saying with enthusiasm, hurrah, my lad. Individually, I'm of your opinion. Walter, with his cheerful laugh, returned the salutation and said only one word more about my uncle at present. Captain Cuttle, I suppose it is impossible that he can have written in the ordinary course by mail packet or ship letter. You understand, aye, my lad, said the captain approvingly, and that you have missed the letter anyhow. Why, Waller, said the captain, turning his eyes upon him with a faint approach to a severe expression, and I've been on the lookout for any tidings of that man of Sojourn Old, Sal Gills, your uncle, day and night ever since I lost him. Ain't my heart been heavy and watchful always along of him, and you sleeping and waking at I been upon my post, and wouldn't I scorn to quit it while this your midshipman held together. Yes, Captain Cuttle, replied Walter, grasping his hand, I know you would, and I know how faithful and earnest all you say and feel is. I'm sure of it. You don't doubt that I am as sure of it as I am that my foot is again upon this doorstep, or that I again have hold of this true hand. Do you know? No, Walter returned the captain with his beaming face. I'll hazard no more conjectures, said Walter fervently, shaking the hard hand of the captain, who shook his with no less goodwill. All I will add is, heaven forbid that I should touch my uncle's possessions. Captain Cuttle, everything that he left here shall remain in the care of the truest of stewards and kindest of men, and if his name is not Cuttle, he has no name now. Best of friends. About Miss Toomby. There was a change in Walter's manner as he came to these 2 words, and when he uttered them all his confidence and cheerfulness appeared to have deserted him. I thought before Miss Toomby stopped me when I spoke of her father last night, said Walter. You remember how Captain well remembered and shook his head. I thought, said Walter, before that we had but one hard duty to perform, and that it was to prevail upon her to communicate with her friends and to return home. Captain muttered a feeble a wasp or a standboy or something or other equally pertinent to the occasion, but it was rendered so extremely feeble by the total discomfiture with which he received this announcement that what it was is mere matter of conjecture. But, said Walter, that is over, I think, so no longer. I would sooner be put back again upon that piece of wreck on which I have so often floated since my preservation in my dreams, and they're left to drift and drive and die. Hurrah, my lad, exclaimed the captain in a burst of uncontrollable satisfaction. Hurrah, 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 to think that she's so young, so good and beautiful, said Walter, so delicately brought up and born to such a different fortune, should strive with the rough world. But we have seen the gulf that cuts off all behind her, though no one but herself can know how deep it is. And there is no return. Captain Cuttle, without quite understanding this, greatly approved of it, and observed in a tone of strong corroboration that the wind was quite abaft. She ought not to be alone here, ought she, Captain Cuttle, said Walter anxiously. Well, my lad, replied the captain, after a little sagacious consideration, I don't know you being here to keep her company, you see, and you too being jointly dear. Captain Cuttle, remonstrated Walter, I being here, Miss Toomey in her guileless innocent heart regards me as her adopted brother. But what would the guile and guilt of my heart be if I pretended to believe that I had any right to approach her familiarly in that character, if I pretended to forget that I am bound in honor not to do it? Waller, my lad, hinted the captain, with some revival of his discomfiture. Ain't there no other character as returned Walter, would you have me die in her esteem, in such esteem as hers, and put a veil between myself and her angel's face forever, by taking advantage of her being here for refuge, so trusting and so unprotected, to endeavor to exalt myself into her lover? What do I say? There is no one in the world who would be more opposed to me if I could do so than you, Waller, my lad, said the captain, drooping more and more, providing as there is any just cause or impediment why two persons should not be joined together in the house of bondage for which you overhaul the place, and make a note. I hope I should declare it as promised and vowed in the banns, so there ain't no other character, ain't there, my lad? Walter briskly waved his hand in a negative. Well, my lad, growled the captain slowly, I won't deny but what I find myself very much down by the head along of this hero, but what I've gone clean about. But as to Lady Lass, Waller, mind you, what's respect and duty to her is respect and duty in my articles, howsomever disappointing, and therefore I follow as in your wake, my lad, and feel as you are no doubt acting up to yourself. And there aren't no other character, aren't there, said the captain, musing over the ruins of his fallen castle with a very despondent face. Now, Captain Cuttle, said Walter, starting a fresh point with a gayer air to cheer the captain up, but nothing could do that. He was much too concerned. I think we should exert ourselves to find someone who would be a proper attendant for Miss Dumby while she remains here, and who may be trusted. None of her relations. May it's clear Miss Dobney feels that they are all subservient to her father. What has become of Susan, the young woman, returned the captain. It's my belief, as she was sent away again, the will of heart's delight. I made a signal for her when Lady Last first come, and she rated of her weary high, and said she had been gone a long time. Then said Walter, do you ask Miss Dumby where she's gone, and we'll try to find her. The morning's getting on, and Miss Dumby will soon be rising. You are her best friend. Wait for her upstairs, and leave me to take care of all down here. The captain, very crestfallen indeed, echoed the sigh with which Walter said this, and complied. Florence was delighted with her new room, anxious to see Walter, and overjoyed at the prospect of greeting her old friend Susan. But Florence could not say where Susan was gone, except that it was in Essex, and no one could say she remembered, unless it were Mr. Toots. With this information, the melancholy captain returned to Walter, and gave him to understand that Mr. Toots was the young gentleman whom he had encountered on the doorstep, and that he was a friend of his, and that he was a young gentleman of property, and that he hopelessly adored Miss Dobby. The captain also related how the intelligence of Walter's supposed fate at first made him acquainted with Mr. Toots, and how there was solemn treaty and compact between them that Mr. Toots should be mute upon the subject of his love. The question then was whether Florence could trust Mr. Toots, and Florence, saying with a smile, oh yes, with her whole heart. It became important to find out where Mr. Toots lived. This Florence didn't know, and the captain had forgotten. And the captain was telling Walter in the little parlor that Mr. Toots was sure to be there soon, when in came Mr. Toots himself. Captain, girls, said Mr. Toots, rushing into the parlor without any ceremony. I'm in a state of mind bordering on distraction. Mr. Toots had discharged those words as from a mortar. before he observed Walter, whom he recognized with what may be described as a chuckle of misery. "You will excuse me, sir," said Mr. Tudes, holding his forehead, "but I am at present in that state that my brain is going, if not gone, and anything approaching to politeness in an individual so situated would be hollow mockery. Captain Kills, I beg to request the favor of a private interview." "Why, brother," returned the captain, taking him by the hand, "you are the man as we was on the look out for." "Oh, Captain Girls," said Mr. Toot, "what a lookout that must be of which I am the object. I haven't dared to shave, I'm in that rash state. I haven't had my clothes brushed, my hair is matted together. I told the chicken that if he offered to clean my boots, I'd stretch him a corpse before me." All these indications of a disordered mind were verified in Mr. Toot's appearance, which was wild and savage. "See here, brother," said the captain, "this year's old Saul Gills Neville Wallerham, as was supposed to have perished at sea." Mr. Toot took his hand from his forehead and stared at Walter. "Good gracious me," stammered Mr. Tooth, "what a complication of misery. How did you— I am afraid you must have caught very wet. Captain Kills, will you allow me a word in the shop?" He took the captain by the coat and, going out with him, whispered that then Captain Gills is the party you spoke of when you said that he and Stormby were made for one another. "Why, my lad," replied the disconsolate captain, "I was of that mind once, and at this time," exclaimed Mr. Toots, with his hand to his forehead again, "of all others a hated rival." "At least he ain't a hated rival," said Mr. Toots, stopping short. "On second thoughts, and taking away his hand, what should I hate him for? No, if my affection has been truly disinterested, Captain Gills, let me prove it now." Mr. Toot shot back abruptly into the parlor and said, wringing Walter by the hand, "How did you— I hope you didn't take any cold. I shall be very glad if you'll give me the pleasure of your acquaintance. I wish you many happy returns of the day, upon my word and honor," said Mr. Toots, warming as he became better acquainted with Walter's face and figure. "I'm very glad to see you." "Thank you heartily," said Walter. "I couldn't desire a more genuine and genial welcome, couldn't you there?" said Mr. Toots, still shaking his hand. "It's very kind of you. I'm much obliged to you. How do you do? I hope you left everybody quite well over the that is upon the— I mean wherever you came from last. You know, all these good wishes and better intentions." Walter responded manfully. "Captain Girls," said Mr. Toos, "I should wish to be straightly honorable, but I trust I may be allowed now to allude to a certain subject." "That I am, my lad," returned the captain. Freely. "Then, Captain Gillies," said Mistrust and Lieutenant Walters, "are you aware that the most dreadful circumstances have been happening at Mr. Dobby's house, and that Miss Dobby herself has left her father, who, in my opinion," said Mr. Tudges with great excitement, "is a brute that it would be a flattery to call her a marble monument or a bird of prey, and that she is not to be found, and has gone no one knows where." "May I ask how you heard this?" inquired Walter. "Left-handed Walters," said Mr. Toots, who had arrived at that appellation by a process peculiar to himself, probably by jumbling up his Christian name with the seafaring profession and supposing some relationship between him and the captain, which would extend as a matter of course to their titles. "Left-handed Walters, I can have no objection to make a straightforward reply. The fact is that, feeling extremely interested in everything that relates to Miss Dombey, not for any selfish reason, Left-handed Waters, for I am well aware that the most agreeable thing that I could do for all parties would be to put an end to my existence, which can only be regarded as an inconvenience. I have been in the habit of bestowing a trifle now and then upon a footman, a most respectable young man of the name of Tollerson, who has lived in the family some time, and Tollerson informed me yesterday evening that this was the state of things, since which Captain Gills and Lieutenant Walters have been perfectly frantic and have been lying down on the sofa all night. "The ruin you behold, Mr. Toots," said Walter. "I am happy to be able to relieve your mind. Pray calm yourself. Miss Dobby is safe and well, sir," cried Mr. Toots, starting from his chair and shaking hands with him anew. "The relief is so excessive and unspeakable that if you were to tell me now that Miss Dombey was married, even I could smile." "Yes, Captain Gillows," said Mr. Toots, appealing to him, "upon my soul and body, I really think whatever I might do to myself immediately afterwards that I could smile. I am so relieved. It will be a greater relief and delight still to such a generous mind as yours, said Walter, not at all slow in returning his greeting, to find that you can render service to Miss Dombey. Captain Cuttle, will you have the kindness to take Mr. Toots upstairs? The captain beckoned to Mr. Toots, who followed him with a bewildered countenance, and ascending to the top of the house was introduced without a word of preparation from his conductor into Florence's new retreat. Poor Mr. Toots's amazement and pleasure at sight of her was such that they could find a vent in nothing but extravagance. He ran up to her, seized her hand, kissed it, dropped it, seized it again, fell upon one knee, shed tears, chuckled, and was quite regardless of his danger of being pinned by Diogenes, who, inspired by the belief that there was something hostile to his mistress in these demonstrations, worked round and round him as if only undecided at what particular point to go in for the assault, but quite resolved to do him a fearful mischief. Oh dear, you bad forgetful dog, dear Mr. Toots, I'm so rejoiced to see you. Thank the said Mr. Toots, I'm pretty well, I'm much obliged to you, Miss Danby. I hope all the family are the same. Mr. Toots said this without the least notion of what he was talking about, and sat down on a chair staring at Florence with the liveliest contention of delight and despair going on in his face that any face could exhibit. Captain Gills, Lieutenant Walters have mentioned Miss Stormbear, gasped Mistrusted, that I can do you some service if I could by any means wash out the remembrance of that day at Brighton when I conducted myself much more like a parasite than a person of independent property, said Mr. Toots with severe self-accusation. I should sink into the silent tomb with a gleam of joy. Pray, Mr. Toots, said Florence, do not wish me to forget anything in our acquaintance. I never can, believe me. You have been far too kind and good to me always. Miss Dunbar, returned Mr. Douce, your consideration for my feelings is a part of your angelic character. Thank you 1,000 times. It's of no consequence at all. What we thought of asking you, said Florence, is whether you remember where Susan, whom you were so kind as to accompany to the coach office when she left me, is to be found. Why, I do not, certainly, Miss Tomboy said Mr. Toots, after a little consideration. Remember the exact name of the place that was on the coach, and I do recollect that she said she was not going to stop there, but was going farther on. But Miss Danby, if your object is to find her, and to have her here myself, and the chicken will produce her with every dispatch, that devotion on my part and great intelligence on the chickens can ensure. Mr. Toots was so manifestly delighted and revived by the prospect of being useful, and the disinterested sincerity of his devotion was so unquestionable that it would have been cruel to refuse him. Florence, with an instinctive delicacy, forbore to urge the least obstacle, though she did not forbear to overpower him with thanks, and Mr. Toots proudly took the commission upon himself for immediate execution. Miss Stormbear, said Mr. Toots, touching her proffered hand with a pang of hopeless love visibly shooting through him and flashing out in his face, goodbye. Allow me to take the liberty of saying that your misfortunes makes me perfectly wretched, and that you may trust me next to Captain Gillies himself. I am quite aware, Miss Damble, of my own deficiencies. They are not of the least consequence, thank you, but I am entirely to be relied upon, I do assure you, Miss Damble. With that, Mr. Toots came out of the room again, accompanied by the captain, who, standing at a little distance, holding his hat under his arm and arranging his scattered locks with his hook, had been a not uninterested witness of what passed. And when the door closed behind them, the light of Mr. Toots's life was darkly clouded again. Captain Gales said, that gentleman, stopping near the bottom of the stairs and turning round, to tell you the truth, I am not in a frame of mind at the present moment in which I could see Lieutenant Walters with that entirely friendly feeling towards him that I should wish to harbor in my breast. We cannot always command our feelings, Captain Kills, and I should take it as a particular favor if you'd let me out at the private door. Brother, returned the captain, you shall shape your own course. Whatever course you take is plain and seaman like. I'm very sure, Captain Giles, said Mr. Toots, you're extremely kind. Your good opinion is a consolation to me. There is one thing, said Mr. Toots, standing in the passage behind the half-open door, that I hope you'll bear in mind, Captain Gills, and that I should wish Lieutenant Walters to be made acquainted with. I have quite come into my property now, you know, and I don't know what to do with it. If I could be at all useful in a pecuniary point of view, I should glide into the silent tomb with ease and smoothness. Mr. Toots said no more, but slipped out quietly and shut the door upon himself to cut the captain off from any reply. Florence thought of this good creature long after he had left her with mingled emotions of pain and pleasure. He was so honest and warm-hearted that to see him again and be assured of his truth to her in her distress was a joy and comfort beyond all price. But for that very reason, it was so affecting to think that she caused him a moment's unhappiness or ruffled by a breath the harmless current of his life, that her eyes filled with tears and her bosom overflowed with pity. Captain Cuttle in his different way thought much of Mr. Toots too, and so did Walter. And when the evening came and they were all sitting together in Florence's new room, Walter praised him in a most impassioned manner and told Florence what he had said on leaving the house, with every graceful setting off in the way of comment and appreciation that his own honesty and sympathy could surround it. With Mr. Toots did not return upon the next day or the next or for several days, and in the meanwhile Florence, without any new alarm, lived like a quiet bird in a cage at the top of the old instrument maker's house. But Florence drooped and hung her head more and more plainly as the days went on, and the expression that had been seen in the face of the dead child was often turned to the sky from her high window, as if it sought his angel out on the bright shore of which he had spoken. Lying on his little bed, Florence had been weak and delicate of late, and the agitation she had undergone was not without its influences on her health. But it was no bodily illness that affected her now. She was distressed in mind, and the cause of her distress was Walter, interested in her, anxious for her, proud and glad to serve her, and showing all this with the enthusiasm and ardor of his character. Florence saw that he avoided her all the long day through. He seldom approached her room. If she asked for him, he came again, for the moment as earnest and as bright as she remembered him when she was a lost child in the staring streets. But he soon became constrained. Her quick affection was too watchful not to know it, and uneasy, and soon left her, and sought. He never came all day between the morning and the night. When the evening closed in, he was always there, and that was her happiest time, for then she half believed that the old Walter of her childhood was not changed. But even then some trivial word, look, or circumstance would show her that there was an indefinable division between them which could not be passed, and she could not but see that these revelations of a great alteration in Walter manifested themselves in despite of his utmost efforts to hide them in his consideration for her, she thought, and in the earnestness of his desire to spare her any wound from his kind hand. He resorted to innumerable little artifices and disguises. So much the more did Florence feel the greatness of the alteration in him, so much the oftener did she weep at this estrangement of her brother, the good captain. Her untiring, tender, ever zealous friend saw it, to Florence thought, and it pained him. He was less cheerful and hopeful than he had been at first, and would steal looks at her and Walter by turns. When they were all free together of an evening, with quite a sad face, Florence resolved at last to speak to Walter. She believed she knew now what the cause of his estrangement was, and she thought it would be a relief to her full heart, and would set him more at ease if she told him she had found it out and quite submitted to it, and did not reproach him. It was on a certain Sunday afternoon that Florence took this resolution. The faithful captain, in an amazing shirt collar, was sitting by her reading with his spectacles on, and she asked him where Walter was. "I think he's down below, my lady," last returned the captain. "I should like to speak to him," said Florence, rising hurriedly as if to go downstairs. "I'll rouse him." "Up here, beauty," said the captain in a trice. Thereupon the captain, with much alacrity, shouldered his book, for he made it a point of duty to read none but very large books on a Sunday, as having a more staid appearance, and had bargained years ago for a prodigious volume at a bookstall, 5 lines of which utterly confounded him at any time, insomuch that he had not yet ascertained of what subject it treated, and withdrew. Walter soon appeared. "Captain Cuttle tells me, Miss Dobby," he eagerly began on coming in, but stopped when he saw her face. "You are not so well today. You look distressed. You have been weeping." He spoke so kindly, and with such a fervent tremor in his voice, that the tears gushed into her eyes. "Walter," said Florence gently, "I am not quite well, and I have been weeping. I want to speak to you." He sat down opposite to her, looking at her beautiful and innocent face, and his own turned pale, and his lips trembled. "You said upon the night when I knew that you were saved, and oh dear Walter, what I felt that night, and what I hope." He put his trembling hand upon the table between them and sat looking at her. "That I was changed. I was surprised to hear you say so, but I understand now that I am. Don't be angry with me, Walter. I was too much overjoyed to think of it." Then she seemed a child to him again. It was the ingenuous, confiding, loving child he saw and heard, not the dear woman at whose feet he would have laid the riches of the earth. "You remember the last time I saw you, Walter, before you went away?" He put his hand into his breast and took out a little purse. "I have always worn it round my neck. If I had gone down in the deep, it would have been with me at the bottom of the sea, and you will wear it still, Walter, for my old sake, until I die." She laid her hand on his as fearlessly and simply as if not a day had intervened since she gave him the little token of remembrance. "I am glad of that. I shall always be glad to think so, Walter. Do you recollect that a thought of this change seemed to come into our minds at the same time that evening when we were talking together?" "No," he answered in a wondering tone. "Yes, Walter, I had been the means of injuring your hopes and prospects. Even then I feared to think so then, but I know it now. If you were able then in your generosity to hide from me that you knew it too, you cannot do so now, although you try as generously as before. You do. I thank you for it, Walter, deeply, truly, but you cannot succeed. You have suffered too much in your own hardships and in those of your dearest relation quite to overlook the innocent cause of all the peril and affliction that has befallen you. You cannot quite forget me in that character, and we can be brother and sister no longer. But dear Walter, do not think that I complain of you in this. I might have known it, or to have known it, but forgot it in my joy. All I hope is that you may think of me less irksomely when this feeling is no more a secret one. And all I ask is, Walter, in the name of the poor child who was your sister once, that you will not struggle with yourself and pain yourself for my sake now that I know all." Walter had looked upon her while she said this with a face so full of wonder and amazement that it had room for nothing else. Now he caught up the hand that touched his so entrancingly and held it between his own. "Oh, Miss Tomboy," he said, "is it possible that while I have been suffering so much and striving with my sense of what is due to you and must be rendered to you, I have made you suffer what your words disclose to me? Never, never before heaven have I thought of you but as the single bright, pure, blessed recollection of my boyhood and my youth. Never have I from the first, and never shall I to the last, regard your part in my life but as something sacred, never to be lightly thought of, never to be esteemed enough, never until death to be forgotten again. To see you look and hear you speak as you did on that night when we parted is happiness to me that there are no words to utter, and to be loved and trusted as your brother is the next gift I could receive and prize." "Walter," said Florence, looking at him earnestly, but with a changing face, "what is that which is due to me and must be rendered to me at the sacrifice of all this respect?" said Walter in a low tone. "Reverence." The color dawned in her face, and she timidly and thoughtfully withdrew her hand, still looking at him with unabated earnestness. "I have not a brother's right," said Walter. "I have not a brother's claim. I left a child. I find a woman." The color overspread her face. She made a gesture as if of entreaty that he would say no more, and her face dropped upon her hands. They were both silent for a time, she weeping. "I owe it to a heart so trusting, pure, and good," said Walter, "even to tear myself from it. Though I rend my own, how dare I say it is my sister." She was weeping still. "If you had been happy, surrounded as you should be by loving and admiring friends, and by all that makes the station you were born to enviable," sobbed Walter, "and if you had called me brother, then in your affectionate remembrance of the past I could have answered to the name from my distant place, with no inward assurance that I wronged your spotless truth by doing so. But here and now, oh thank you, thank you, Walter. Forgive my having wronged you so much. I had no one to advise me. I am quite alone." "Florence," said Walter passionately, "I am hurried on to say what I thought but a few moments ago. Nothing could have forced from my lips. If I had been prosperous, if I had any means or hope of being one day able to restore you to a station near your own, I would have told you that there was one name you might bestow upon me, a right above all others to protect and cherish you, that I was worthy of in nothing but the love and honor that I bore you, and in my whole heart being yours, I would have told you that it was the only claim that you could give me to defend and guard you, which I dare accept and dare assert, but that if I had that right, I would regard it as a trust so precious and so priceless that the undivided truth and fervor of my life would poorly acknowledge its worth. The head was still bent down, the tears still falling, and the bosom swelling with its sobs. Dear Florence, dearest Florence, whom I called so in my thoughts, before I could consider how presumptuous and wild it was, one last time, let me call you by your own dear name, and touch this gentle hand in token of your sisterly forgetfulness of what I have said. She raised her head and spoke to him with such a solemn sweetness in her eyes, with such a calm, bright, placid smile shining on him through her tears, with such a low, soft tremble in her frame and voice, that the innermost chords of his heart were touched, and his sight was dim as he listened. No, Walter, I cannot forget it. I would not forget it for the world. Are you very poor? I am but a wanderer, said Walter, making voyages to live across the sea. That is my calling now. Are you soon going away again? Walter, very soon, she said, looking at him for a moment, then timidly put her trembling hand in his. If you will take me for your wife, Walter, I will love you dearly, if you will let me go with you, Walter. I will go to the world's end without fear. I can give up nothing for you. I have nothing to resign and no one to forsake, but all my love and life shall be devoted to you, and with my last breath I will breathe your name to God. If I have sense and memory left. He caught her to his heart and laid her cheek against his own, and now no more repulsed, no more forlorn, she wept indeed upon the breast of her dear lover. Blessed Sunday bells ringing so tranquilly in their enchanted and happy ears, blessed Sunday peace and quiet harmonizing with the calmness in their souls, and making holy air around them. Blessed twilight stealing on, and shading her so soothingly and gravely as she falls asleep like a hushed child upon the bosom she has clung to. O load of love and trustfulness that lies so lightly there. I look down on the closed eyes, Walter, with a proudly tender gaze, for in all the wide, wide world they seek but thee. Now only thee. The captain remained in the little parlor until it was quite dark. He took the chair on which Walter had been sitting and looked up at the skylight until the day by little and little faded away and the stars peeped down. He lighted a candle, lighted a pipe, smoked it out, and wondered what on earth was going on upstairs and why they didn't call him to tea. Florence came to his side while he was in the height of his wonderment. "Aye, lady lass," cried the captain, "while you and Waller have had a long spell o' talk, my beauty." Florence put her little hand round one of the great buttons of his coat and said, looking down into his face, "Dear Captain, I want to tell you something, if you please." The captain raised his head pretty smartly to hear what it was catching by this means a more distinct view of Florence. He pushed back his chair and himself with it as far as they could go. "What heart's delight!" cried the captain, suddenly elated. "Is it that?" "Yes," said Florence eagerly. "Waller husband?" "That," roared the captain, tossing up his glazed hat into the skylight. "Yes," cried Florence, laughing and crying together. The captain immediately hugged her, and then picking up the glazed hat and putting it on, drew her arm through his and conducted her upstairs again, where he felt that the great joke of his life was now to be made. "What water, my lad?" said the captain, looking in at the door with his face like an amiable warming pan. "So there ain't no other character, ain't there?" He had liked to have suffocated himself with this pleasantry, which he repeated at least 40 times during tea, polishing his radiant face with the sleeve of his coat and dabbing his head all over with his pocket handkerchief in the intervals, but he was not without a graver source of enjoyment to fall back upon when so disposed, for he was repeatedly heard to say in an undertone, as he looked with ineffable delight at Walter and Florence, added, "Cuddle, my lad, you never shaped a better course in your life than when you made that their little property over jointly." Chapter 51. Mr. Dombey and the world. What is the proud man doing while the days go by? Does he ever think of his daughter or wonder where she has gone? Does he suppose she has come home and is leading her old life in the weary house? No one can answer for him. He has never uttered her name, since his household dread him too much to approach a subject on which he is resolutely dumb. and the only person who dares question him he silences immediately. My dear Paul, murmurs his sister sidling into the room on the day of Florence's departure. Your wife, that upstart woman, is it possible that what I hear confusedly is true, and that this is her return for your unparalleled devotion to her, extending, I am sure, even to the sacrifice of your own relations, to her caprices and haughtiness, my poor brother, with this speech feelingly reminiscent of her not having been asked to dinner on the day of the first party. Mrs. Check makes great use of her pocket handkerchief and falls on Mr. Dobby's neck, but Mr. Dobby frigidly lifts her off and hands her to a chair. I thank you, Louisa, he says, for this mark of your affection, but desire that our conversation may refer to any other subject. When I bewail my fate, Louisa, or express myself as being in want of consolation, you can offer it if you will have the goodness. My dear Paul, rejoins his sister with her handkerchief to her face and shaking her head. I know your great spirit, and will say no more upon a theme so painful and revolting, on the heads of which two adjectives Mrs. Chick visits scathing indignation. But pray let me ask you, though I dread to hear something that will shock and distress me, that unfortunate child Florence. Louisa, says her brother sternly. Silence. Not another word of this. Mrs. Chick can only shake her head and use her handkerchief and moan over degenerate dandies who are no dandies. But whether Florence has been inculpated in the flight of Edith, or has followed her, or has done too much or too little, or anything or nothing, she has not the least idea. He goes on without deviation, keeping his thoughts and feelings close within his own breast and imparting them to no one. He makes no search for his daughter. He may think that she is with his sister, or that she is under his own roof. He may think of her constantly, or he may never think about her. It is all one for any sign he makes. But this is sure, he does not think that he has lost her. He has no suspicion of the truth. He has lived too long shut up in his towering supremacy, seeing her a patient, gentle creature in the path below, to have any fear of that shaken, as he is by his disgrace. He is not yet humbled to the level earth. The root is broad and deep, and in the course of its years its fibers have spread out and gathered nourishment. From everything around it the tree is struck, but not down, though he hide the world within him from the world without, which he believes has but one purpose for the time, and that to watch him eagerly wherever he goes. He cannot hide those rebel traces of it which escape in hollow eyes and cheeks, a haggard forehead, and a moody brooding air, impenetrable as before. He is still an altered man, and proud as ever. He is humbled, or those marks would not be there. The world, what the world thinks of him, how it looks at him, what it sees in him, and what it says, this is the haunting demon of his mind. It is everywhere where he is, and worse than that, it is everywhere where he is not. It comes out with him among his servants, and yet he leaves it whispering behind. He sees it pointing after him in the street. It is waiting for him in his hunting house. It leers over the shoulders of rich men among the merchants. It goes beckoning and babbling among the crowd. It always anticipates him in every place, and is always busiest, he knows, when he is gone away, when he is shut up in his room at night. It is in his house outside it, audible in footsteps on the pavement, visible in print upon the table, steaming to and fro on railroads, and in ships, restless and busy everywhere with nothing else but him. It is not a phantom of his imagination. It is as active in other people's minds as in his witness cousin Phoenix, who comes from Bardon, purposely to talk to him. Witness Major Bagstock, who accompanies cousin Phoenix on that friendly mission. Mr. Dombey receives them with his usual dignity, and stands erect in his old attitude before the fire. He feels that the world is looking at him out of their eyes, that it is in the stare of the pictures, that Mr. Pitt upon the bookcase represents it, that there are eyes in its own map hanging on the wall. An unusually cold spring, says Mr. Dombey, to deceive the world dames. Ah, says the Major in the warmth of friendship, Joseph Bagstock is a bad hand to a counterfeit. If you want to hold your friends off dandy, and to give them the cold shoulder, J. B. is not the man for your purpose. Joe is rough and tough. Sir Blunt is Joe. His Royal Highness the late Duke of York did me the honor to say, deservedly or undeservedly, never mind, that if there is a man in the service on whom I can depend for coming to the point, that man is Joe Bagstock. Mr. Dombey intimates his acquiescence. Now Dombey, says the Major, I am a man of the world. Our friend Phoenix if I may presume to honored, I am sure, says Cousin Phoenix. He is proceeds the Major, with a wag of his head, also a man of the world, don't be. You are a man of the world now when three men of the world meet together, and are friends, as I believe, again appealing to Cousin Felix. I am sure, says Cousin Phoenix, most friendly, and our friends, resumes the Major. Ojo's opinion is, I may be wrong, that the opinion of the world on any particular subject is very easily got at, undoubtedly, says Cousin Phoenix. In point of fact, it's quite a self-evident sort of thing. I am extremely anxious, Major, that my friend Dorbs should hear me express my very great astonishment and regret that my lovely and accomplished relative, who is possessed of every qualification to make a man happy, should have so far forgotten what was due to, in point of fact, to the world as to commit herself in such a very extraordinary manner. I have been in a devilish state of depression ever since, and said indeed to Long Saxby last night, man of 6'10", with whom my friend Dob is probably acquainted, that it had upset me in a confounded way, and made me bilious. It induces a man to reflect this kind of fatal catastrophe, says Cousin Phoenix, that events to occur in quite a providential manner, for if my aunt had been living at the time, I think the effect upon a devilishly lively woman like herself would have been prostration, and that she would have fallen, in point of fact, a victim. Now don't be, says the Major, resuming his discourse with great energy. I beg your pardon, interposes Cousin Phoenix. Allow me another word. My friend Dombey will permit me to say that if any circumstance could have added to the most infernal state of pain in which I find myself on this occasion, it would be the natural amazement of the world at my lovely and accomplished relative, as I must still beg leave to call her, being supposed to have so committed herself with a person, man with white teeth, in point of fact, of very inferior station to her husband. But while I must rather peremptorily request my friend Dombey not to criminate my lovely and accomplished relative until her criminality is perfectly established, I beg to assure my friend Dombey that the family I represent, and which is now almost extinct, devilish sad reflection, for a man will interpose no obstacle in his way, and will be happy to assent to any honorable course of proceeding, with a view to the future that he may point out. I trust my friend Dombey will give me credit for the intentions by which I am animated in this very melancholy affair, and in point of fact, I am not aware that I need trouble my friend Dombey with any further observations. Mr. Dombey bows without raising his eyes, and is silent now. Dombey, says the Major, our friend Phoenix, having with an amount of eloquence that old Joby has never heard surpassed. No, by the Lord, sir, never, says the Major, very blue indeed, and grasping his cane in the middle, stated the case as regards the lady. I shall presume upon our friendship, Don Berto, to offer a word on another aspect of it, sir, says the Major, with a horse's cough. The world in these things has opinions which must be satisfied. I know it, rejoins Mr. Dombey. Of course you know it, don't be, says the Major. Damn it, sir, I know you know it. A man of your caliber is not likely to be ignorant of it. I hope not, replies Mr. Dobby, says the Major. You will guess the rest. I speak out prematurely, perhaps, because the Bagstock breed have always spoke out little, sir. Have they ever got by doing it? But it's in the Bagstock blood. A shot is to be taken at this man. You have J. Beer to elbow. He claims the name of friend. God bless you, Major, returns Mr. Dombey. I am obliged. I shall put myself in your hands when the time comes. Time not being come, I have forborne to speak to you. Where's the fellow, Dombey, inquires the Major, after gasping and looking at him for a minute. I don't know any intelligence of him, asks the Major. Yes, Dombey, I am rejoiced to hear that, says the Major. I congratulate you. You will excuse even you, Major, replies Mr. Dombey, my entering into any further detail at present. The intelligence is of a singular kind and singularly obtained. It may turn out to be valueless, it may turn out to be true, I cannot say at present. My explanation must stop here. Although this is but a dry reply to the Major's purple enthusiasm, the Major receives it graciously, and is delighted to think that the world has such a fair prospect of soon receiving its due. Cousin Phoenix is then presented with his meed of acknowledgement by the husband of his lovely and accomplished relative, and Cousin Phoenix and Major Bagstock retire, leaving that husband to the world again, and to ponder at leisure on their representation of its state of mind concerning his affairs, and on its just and reasonable expectations. But who sits in the housekeeper's room shedding tears and talking to Mrs. Peepkin in a low tone, with uplifted hands. It is a lady with her face concealed in a very close black bonnet, which appears not to belong to her. It is Miss Tokes, who has borrowed this disguise from her servant and comes from Princess. Place this secretly to revive her old acquaintance with Mrs. Peepkin in order to get certain information of the state of Mr. Dombey. How does he bear it, my dear creature, asks Miss Tokes. Well, says Mrs. Pipkin in her snappish way, he's pretty much as usual externally, suggests Miss Tokes, but what he feels within Mrs. Pipkin's hard gray eye looks doubtful as she answers in 3 distinct jerks. Perhaps, I suppose so. To tell you my mind, Lucretia, says Mrs. Peepkin. She still calls Miss Tokes Lucretia on account of having made her first experiments in the child-quelling line of business on that lady when an unfortunate and weazened little girl of tender years. To tell you my mind, Lucretia, I think it's a good riddance. I don't want any of your brazen faces here myself. Brazen indeed. Well, may you say brazen, Mrs. Pipkin, returned Miss Tokes, to leave him such a noble figure of a man. And here Miss Tokes is overcome. I don't know about noble, I'm sure, observes Mrs. Peepkin, irascibly rubbing her nose. But I know this, that when people meet with trials, they must bear them hot. I've had enough to bear myself in my time. What a fuss there is. She's gone, and well got rid of. Nobody wants her back. I should think this hint of the Peruvian mine's cause is Miss Tokes to rise to go away. When Mrs. Peepkin rings the bell for Tallinson to show her out, Mr. Tallinson, not having seen Miss Tokes for ages, grins and hopes she's well, observing that he didn't know her at first in that bonnet pretty well. Tarlinson, I thank you, says Miss Tokes. I beg you'll have the goodness, when you happen to see me here, not to mention it. My visits are merely to Mrs. Peepkin. Very good, miss, says Taliesin. Shocking circumstances occur, Taliesin, says Miss Tokes. Very much so indeed, miss, rejoins Taliesin. I hope, Taliesin, says Miss Tokes, who in her instruction of the Tootle family has acquired an admonitory tone and a habit of improving passing occasions, that what has happened here will be a warning to you. Tarleton, thank you, miss, I'm sure, says Tarleton. He appears to be falling into a consideration of the manner in which this warning ought to operate in his particular case, when the vinegary Mrs. Peepkin suddenly stirring him up with a what are you doing? Why don't you show the lady to the door? He ushers Miss Tokes forth. As she passes Mr. Dombey's room, she shrinks into the inmost depths of the black bonnet and walks on tiptoe, and there is not another atom in the world which haunts him, so that feels such sorrow and solicitude about him as Miss Tokes takes out under the black bonnet into the street and tries to carry home shadowed from the newly lighted lamps. But Miss Tokes is not a part of Mr. Dombey's world. She comes back every evening at dusk, adding clogs and an umbrella to the bonnet on wet nights, and bears the grins and the huffs and rebuffs of Mrs. Peepkin and all, to ask how he does and how he bears his misfortune. But she has nothing to do with Mr. Dombey's world, exacting and harassing as ever it goes on without her, and she, a by no means bride to a particular star, moves in her little orbit in the corner of another system, and knows it quite well, and comes and cries and goes away, and is satisfied. Verily, Miss Tokes is easier of satisfaction than the world that troubles Mr. Dombey so much. At the counting house, the clerks discuss the great disaster in all its lights and shades, but chiefly wonder who will get Mr. Carr's place. They are generally of opinion that it will be shorn of some of its emoluments and made uncomfortable by newly devised checks and restrictions, and those who are beyond all hope of it are quite sure they would rather not have it, and don't at all envy the person for whom it may prove to be reserved. Nothing like the prevailing sensation has existed in the counting house since Mr. Dombey's little son died, but all such excitements that take a social, not to say a jovial turn, and lead to the cultivation of good fellowship or reconciliation, is established on this propitious occasion between the acknowledged wits of the counting house and an aspiring rival with whom he has been in a deadly feud for months, and a little dinner being proposed in commemoration of their happily restored amity takes place at a neighboring tavern, the Wit Inn. The chair, the rival acting as vice president. The orations following the removal of the cloth are opened by the chair, who says, "Gentlemen, he can't disguise from himself that this is not a time for private dissensions. Recent occurrences, to which he need not more particularly allude, but which have not been altogether without notice in some Sunday papers, and in a daily paper which he need not name here every other member of the company names it in an audible murmur have caused him to reflect, and he feels that for him and Robinson, to have any personal differences at such a moment would be forever to deny that good feeling in the general cause for which he has reason to think and hope that the gentlemen in Dobby's house have always been distinguished. Robinson replies to this like a man and a brother and one gentleman who has been in the office 3 years under continual notice to quit on account of lapses in his arithmetic appears in a perfectly new light, suddenly bursting out with a thrilling speech in which he says, may their respected chief never again know the desolation which has fallen on his hearth, and says a great variety of things, beginning with may he never again, which are received with thunders of applause. In short, a most delightful evening is passed, only interrupted by a difference between two juniors who, quarreling about the probable amount of Mr. Parker's late receipts per annum, defy each other with decanters and are taken out. Greatly excited soda water is in general request at the office next day, and most of the party deem the bill an imposition as to perch the messenger. He is in a fair way of being ruined for life. He finds himself again constantly in bars of public houses, being treated and lying dreadfully. It appears that he met everybody concerned in the late transaction everywhere, and said to them, sir or madam, as the case was, why do you look so pale? At which each shuddered from head to foot and said, oh, perch, and ran away. Either the consciousness of these enormities or the reaction consequent on liquor reduces Mr. Perch to an extreme state of low spirits at that hour of the evening when he usually seeks consolation in the society of Mrs. Perch at Ball's Pond, and Mrs. Perch frets a good deal, for she fears his confidence in women is shaken now, and that he half expects on coming home at night to find her gone off with some vicar, which, as she observes to an intimate female friend, is what these wretches in the form of woman have to answer for Mrs. P. It ain't the harm they do themselves so much as what they reflect upon us, ma'am, and I see it in Perch's eye. Mr. Dombey's servants are becoming at the same time quite dissipated and unfit for other service. They have hot suppers every night and talk it over with smoking drinks upon the board. Mr. Tillinson is always maudlin after 10:30 and frequently begs to know whether he didn't say that no good would ever come of living in a corner house. They whisper about Miss Florence and wonder where she is, but agree that if Mr. Dombey don't know Mrs. Dombey does. This brings them to the latter, of whom cook says she had a stately way, though hadn't she, but she was too high. They all agree that she was too high, and Mr. Tallinson's old flame, the housemaid, who is very virtuous, entreats that you will never talk to her any more about people who hold their heads up as if the ground wasn't good enough for everything that is said and done about it except by Mr. Dombey is done in chorus. Mr. Dombey and the world are alone together. Chapter 50. The Secret Intelligence. Good Mrs. Brown and her daughter Alice kept silent company together in their own dwelling. It was early in the evening and late in the spring, but a few days had elapsed since Mr. Dombey had told Major Bagstock of his singular intelligence, singularly obtained, which might turn out to be valueless and might turn out to be true, and the world was not satisfied yet. The mother and daughter sat for a long time without interchanging a word, almost without motion. The old woman's face was shrewdly anxious and expectant. That of her daughter was expectant too, but in a less sharp degree, and sometimes it darkened as if with gathering disappointment and incredulity. The old woman, without heeding these changes in its expression, though her eyes were often turned towards it, sat mumbling and munching and listening confidently. Their abode, though poor and miserable, was not so utterly wretched as in the days when only good Mrs. Brown inhabited it. Some few attempts at cleanliness and order were manifest, though made in a reckless gypsy way that might have connected them at a glance with the younger woman. The shades of evening thickened and deepened as the two kept silence until the blackened walls were nearly lost in the prevailing gloom. Then Alice broke the silence, which had lasted so long, and said, you may give him up, mother. He'll not come here. Death, give him up, returned the old woman impatiently. He will come here, we shall see, said Alice. We shall see him, returned her mother. And doomsday, said the daughter. You think I'm in my second childhood. I know, croaked the old woman. That's the respect and duty that I get from my own gal, but I'm wiser than you. take me for he'll come t'other a day. When I touched his coat in the street he looked round as if I was a toad. But Lord to see him, when I said their names and asked him if he'd like to find out where they was it so angry asked her. Daughter roused to interest in a moment angry ask if it was bloody. That's more like the word angry, ha to call that only angry said the old woman hobbling to the cupboard and lighting a candle, which displayed the workings of her mouth too. Ugly advantage as she brought it to the table I might as well call your face only angry. When you think or talk about him it was something different from that truly, as she sat as still as a crouched tigress with her kindling eyes. Hark said the old woman triumphantly, I hear a step coming. It's not the tread of anyone that lives about here or comes this way often. We don't walk like that. We should grow proud on such neighbors. Do you hear him? I believe you are right, mother, replied Alice in a low voice. Peace opened the door as she drew herself within her shawl and gathered it about her. The old woman complied and peering out and beckoning gave admission to Mr. Dombey, who stopped when he had set his foot within the door and looked distrustfully around. It's a poor place for a great gentleman like your worship, said the old woman curtsying and chattering. I told you so, but there's no harm in it. Who is that? Asked Mr. Dombey looking at her companion. That's my handsome daughter, said the old woman. Your worship won't mind her. She knows all about it. A shadow fell upon his face, not less expressive than if he had groaned aloud. Who does not know all about it? But he looked at her steadily, and she, without any acknowledgement of his presence, looked at him. The shadow on his face was darker when he turned his glance away from her, and even then it wandered back again furtively, as if he were haunted by her bold eyes, and some remembrance they inspired. Woman, said Mr. Dombey to the old witch, who was chuckling and leering close at his elbow, and who, when he turned to address her, pointed stealthily at her daughter and rubbed her hands and pointed again. Woman, I believe that I am weak and forgetful of my station in coming here, but you know why I come and what you offered when you stopped me in the street the other day. What is it that you have to tell me concerning what I want to know and how? Does it happen that I can find voluntary intelligence in a hovel like this? With a disdainful glance about him, when I have exerted my power and means to obtain it in vain? I do not think, he said after a moment's pause, during which he had observed her sternly, that you are so audacious as to mean to trifle with me or endeavor to impose upon me. But if you have that purpose, you'd better stop on the threshold of your scheme. My humor is not a trifling one, and my acknowledgement will be severe. Oh, a proud, hard gentleman, chuckled the old woman, shaking her head and rubbing her shriveled hands. Oh, hard eyes and ears, with your own ears, not with ours. And if your worship's put upon their track, you won't mind paying something for it, will you? Honorable dearie, money, returned Mr. Dombey, apparently relieved and assured by this inquiry, will bring about unlikely things. I know may return even means as unexpected and unpromising as these to account. Yes, for any reliable information I receive, I will pay. But I must have the information first and judge for myself of its value. Do you know nothing more powerful than money? Asked the younger woman without rising or altering her attitude. Not here, I should imagine, said Mr. Dombey. You should know of something that is more powerful elsewhere, as I judge, she returned. Do you know nothing of a woman's anger? You have a saucy tongue, Jade, said Mr. Dombey. Not usually, she answered without any show of emotion. I speak to you now that you may understand us better and rely more on us. A woman's anger is pretty much the same here as in your fine house. I am angry. I have been so many years. I have as good cause for my anger as you have for yours, and its object is the same man. He started in spite of himself and looked at her with astonishment. Yes, she said with a kind of laugh. Wide as the distance may seem between us, it is so. How it is so is no matter. That is my story, and I keep my story to myself. I would bring you and him together because I have a rage against him. My mother there is avaricious and poor, and she would sell any tide and she could glean, or anything or anybody, for money. It is fair enough perhaps that you should pay her some if she can help you to what you want to know, but that is not my motive. I have told you what mine is, and it would be as strong and all sufficient with me if you haggled and bargained with her for sixpence. I have done. My saucy tongue says no more. If you wait here till sunrise tomorrow. The old woman, who had shown great uneasiness during this speech, which had a tendency to depreciate her expected gains, pulled Mr. Dobby softly by the sleeve and whispered to him not to mind her. He glared at them both by turns with a haggard look and said in a deeper voice than was usual with him, "Go on, what do you know?" "Oh, not so fast, your worship, we must wait for someone," answered the old woman. "It's to be got from someone else," wormed out Screwed and twisted from him. "What do you mean?" said Mr. Dumby. "Patience," she croaked, laying a hand like a claw upon his arm. "Patience, I'll get at it, I know I can, if he was to hold it." "Back from me," said good Mrs. Brown, crooking her 10 fingers. "I'd tear it out of him." Mr. Dombey followed her with his eyes as she hobbled to the door and looked out again, and then his glance sought her daughter, but she remained impassive, silent, and regardless of him. "To tell me, woman," he said, when the band figure of Mrs. Brown came back, shaking its head and chattering to itself, "that there is another person expected here." "Yes," said the old woman, looking up into his face and nodding, "from whom you are to exact the intelligence that is to be useful to me." "Yes," said the old woman, nodding again. "A stranger chat," said the old woman with a shrill laugh, "what signifies?" Well, no stranger to your worship. But he won't see you, he'd be afraid of you, and wouldn't talk. You'll stand behind that door and judge him for yourself. We don't ask to be believed on trust. What your worship doubts the room behind the door. Oh, the suspicion of you rich gentlefolks. Look at it then. Her sharp eye had detected an involuntary expression of this feeling on his part, which was not unreasonable under the circumstances. In satisfaction of it, she now took the candle to the door. She spoke of Mr. Dombey, looked and assured himself that it was an empty, crazy room, and signed to her to put the light back in its place. "How long," he asked, "before this person comes?" "Not long," she answered. "Would your worship sit down for a few odd minutes?" He made no answer, but began pacing the room with an irresolute air, as if he were undecided whether to remain or depart, and as if he had some quarrel with himself for being there at all. But soon his tread grew slower and heavier, and his face more sternly thoughtful, as the object with which he had come fixed itself in his mind and dilated there again. While he thus walked up and down with his eyes on the ground, Mrs. Brown, in the chair from which she had risen to receive him, sat listening, and knew the monotony of his step, or the uncertainty of age, made her so slow of hearing that a footfall without had sounded in her daughter's ears for some moments, and she had looked up hastily to warn her mother of its approach, before the old woman was roused by it. But then she started from her seat, and whispering, "Here he is," hurried her visitor to his place of observation, and put a bottle and glass upon the table with such alacrity as to be ready to fling her arms around the neck of Rob the grinder on his appearance at the door. "And here's my bunny boy," cried Mrs. Brown at last. "Oh, ho, 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 you're like my own son, Robbie." "Oh, Mrs. Brown," remonstrated the grinder, "can't you be fond of a cove without squeezing and throttling of him? Take care of the bird cage in our hand, will you?" "Thinks of a bird cage for me," cried the old woman, apostrophizing the ceiling, "me that feels more than a mother for him. Well, I'm sure I'm very much obliged to you, Mrs. Brown," said the unfortunate youth, greatly aggravated. "But you're so jealous of a cove. I'm very fond of you myself, and all that, of course, but I don't smother you, do I, Mrs. Brown?" He looked and spoke as if he would have been far from objecting to do so, however, on a favorable occasion, and to talk about bird cages to whimpered the grinder, as if that was a crime. "Why, looky here, do you know who this belongs to master, do you?" said the old woman with a grin. "Ah," replied the grinder, lifting a large cage tied up in a wrapper on the table and untying it with his teeth and hands. "It's our parrot. This is Mr. Carter's parrot, Rob." "Will you hold your tongue, Mrs. Brown?" returned the goaded grinder. "What you go naming names for? I'm blessed," said Rob, pulling his hair with both hands in the exasperation of his feelings, "if she ain't enough to make a cove run wild. What do you snub me, thankless boy?" cried the old woman with ready vehemence. "Good gracious, Mrs. Brown, no," returned the grinder with tears in his eyes. "Was ever such a year? Don't I doubt upon you, Mrs. Brown. Do you, sweet Rob? Do you truly, chickabiddy?" With that, Mrs. Brown held him in her fond embrace once more, and did not release him until he had made several violent and ineffectual struggles with his legs, and his hair was standing on end all over his head. "Oh," returned the grinder, "what a thing it is to be perfectly pitched into with affection like this here. "I wish you was. How have you been, Mrs. Brown? I'm not here since this night week," said the old woman, contemplating him with a look of reproach. "Good gracious, Mrs. Brown," returned the grinder. "I said tonight's a week that I'd come tonight. Didn't I? And here I am. Howdy do. Go on. I wish you'd be a little rational, Mrs. Brown. I'm hoarse with saying things in my defense, and my very face is shiny with being hugged." He rubbed it hard with his sleeve as if to remove the tender polishing. "Question, drink a little drop to comfort you, my Robin," said the old woman, filling the glass from the bottle and giving it to him. "Thank you, Mrs. Brown," returned the grinder. "Here's your health, and long may you, etc." Which the judge, from the expression of his face, did not include any very choice blessings. "And here's your Ralph," said the grinder, glancing at Alice, who sat with her eyes fixed, as it seemed to him, on the wall behind him, but in reality on Mr. Dombey's face at the door, and wishing her the same, and many of them. He drained the glass to these sentiments and set it down. "Well, I say, Mrs. Brown," he proceeded to go on, "a little rational. Now you're a judge of birds, and up to their ways, as I know." "To my cost," repeated Mrs. Brown, satisfaction. "I mean," returned the grinder. "How do you do? Take up a cove, Mrs. Brown. You've put it all out of my head again." "Judge of birds, Robbie," suggested the old woman. "Ah," said the grinder. "Well, I've got to take care of this parrot, certain things being sold and a certain establishment broke up, and as I don't want no notice took at present, I wish you'd attend to her for a week or so, and give her board and a lodging, will you, if I must come?" Backwards and forwards mused the grinder with a dejected face. "I may as well have something to come for, screamed the old woman. "Besides you, I mean, Mrs. Brown," returned the craven Rob. "Not that I want any inducement, but yourself, Mrs. Brown. I'm sure don't begin again, for goodness sake. He don't care for me, he don't care for me as I care for him," cried Mrs. Brown, lifting up her skinny hands. "But I'll take care of his bird, take good care of it too. You." "No, Mrs. Brown," said Rob, shaking his head. "If you were so much as to stroke its feathers once the wrong way, I'll believe it would be found out." "Ah, so sharp was that, Rob?" said Mrs. Brown quickly. "Sharp, Mrs. Brown," repeated Rob. "But this is not to be talked about." Checking himself abruptly, and not without a fearful glance across the room, Rob filled the glass again, and having slowly emptied it, shook his head and began to draw his fingers across and across the wires of the parrot's cage by way of diversion from the dangerous theme that had just been broached. The old woman eyed him slyly, and hitching her chair nearer his, and looking in at the parrot, who came down from the gilded dome at her call, said, "Out of place now, Robbie." "Never you mind, Mrs. Brown," returned the grinder shortly. "Board wages, perhaps, Rob," said Mrs. Brown. "Pretty Polly," said the grinder. The old woman darted a glance at him that might have warned him to consider his ears in danger, but it was his turn to look in at the parrot now, and however expressive his imagination may have made her angry scowl, it was unseen by his bodily eyes. "I wonder master didn't take you with him, Rob," said the old woman in a wheedling voice, but with increased malignity of aspect. Rob was so absorbed in contemplation of the parrot and in trolling his forefinger on the wires that he made no answer. The old woman had her clutch within a hair's breadth of his shock of hair as it stooped over the table, but she restrained her fingers and said in a voice that choked with its effort to be coaxing, "Robbie, my child." "Well, Mrs. Brown," returned the grinder, "I say, I wonder master didn't take you with him, dear." "Never you mind, Mrs. Brown," returned the grinder. Mrs. Brown instantly directed the clutch of her right hand at his hair, and the clutch of her left hand at his throat, and held on to the object of her fond affection with such extraordinary fury that his face began to blacken in a moment. "Mrs. Bright," exclaimed the grinder, "let go, will you? What are you doing? Off, help, young woman." Mrs. Bright. The young woman, however, equally unmoved by his direct appeal to her, and by his inarticulate utterance, remained quite neutral, until after struggling with his assailant into a corner, Rob disengaged himself, and stood there panting and fenced in by his own elbows, while the old woman, panting too and stamping with rage and eagerness, appeared to be collecting her energies for another swoop upon him. At this crisis Alice interposed her voice, but not in the grinder's favor, by saying, "Well done, mother, tear him to pieces." "What, young woman," blubbered Dub, "are you against me too? What have I been and done? What am I to be taught to pieces, for I should like to know why'd you take a joker cove, who's never done you any harm, neither of you call yourselves females to said the frightened and deflected Grinder with his coat covered his eye. I'm surprised at you, where's your feminine tenderness, you thankless dog, gasped Mrs. Brown. You impudent, insulting dog, what have I been and done to go and give you offense? Mrs. Brown retorted the fearful Rob. You was very much attached to me a minute ago to cut me off with his short answers and his sulky words, said the old woman. Me, because I happened to be curious to have a little bit of gossip about master, and the lady to dare to play it fast and loose with me. But I'll talk to you no more, my lad. Now go. I'm sure, Mrs. Brown, returned the abject Grinder. I never insinuated that I wish to go. Don't talk like that, Mrs. Brown, if you please. I won't talk at all, said Mrs. Brown, with an action of her crooked fingers that made him shrink into half his natural compass in the corner. Not another word with him shall pass my lips. He's an ungrateful hound. I cast him off. Now let him go, and I'll slip those after him that shall talk to much that won't be shook away, that'll hang to him like leeches and slink after him like foxes. What he knows he knows his old games and his old ways. If he's forgotten them, they'll soon remind him. Now let him go and see how he'll do master's business and keep master's secrets with such company always following him up and down. Ha ha ha, you'll find him a different sort from you and me, ollie close as he is with you and me. Now let him go, now let him go. The old woman, to the unspeakable dismay of the Grinder, walked her twisted figure round and round in a ring of some 4 feet in diameter, constantly repeating these words and shaking her fist above her head and working her mouth about. Mrs. Brown, pleaded Rob, coming a little out of his corner. I'm sure you wouldn't injure a cove on second thoughts. Ain't cold blood, would you? Don't talk to me, said Mrs. Brown, still wrathfully pursuing her circle. Now let him go, now let him go, Mrs. Brown urged the tormented Grinder. I didn't mean to. Oh, what a thing it is for cove to get into such a line as this. I was only careful of talking, Mrs. Brown, because I always am on account of his being up to everything, but I might have known it wouldn't have gone any further. I'm sure I'm quite agreeable with a wretched face for any little bit of gossip. Mrs. Brown, don't go on like this, if you please, or couldn't you have the goodness to put in a word for a miserable cow here, said the Grinder, appealing in desperation to the daughter come mother. You hear what he says, she interposed in her stern voice and with an impatient action of her head. Try him once more, and if you fall out with him again, ruin him if you like, and I've done with him. Mrs. Brown, moved as it seemed by this very tender exhortation, presently began to howl, and softening by degrees took the apologetic Grinder to her arms, who embraced her with a face of unutterable woe, and like a victim, as he was resumed his former seat close by the side of his venerable friend, whom he suffered not without much constrained sweetness of countenance, combating very expressive physiognomical revelations of an opposite character, to draw his arm through hers and keep it there. And how's master, dearie dear, said Mrs. Brown, when sitting in this amicable posture they had pledged each other. Hush, if you'd be so good, Mrs. Brown, as to speak a little lower, Rob implored. Why, he's pretty well, thank you. I suppose you're not out of place, Robbie, said Mrs. Brown in a wheedling tone. Why, I'm not exactly out of place nor in faulted, Rob. I'm still in pain, Mrs. Brown, and nothing to do, Rob, nothing particular to do just now, Mrs. Brown, but to keep my eyes open, said the Grinder, rolling them in a full-on way. Oh, for goodness sake, Mrs. Brown, couldn't you gossip with a cove about anything else, cried the Grinder in a burst of despair. The impetuous Mrs. Brown, rising directly, the tortured Grinder detained her, stammering, yes, Mrs. Brown, I believe he's abroad. What is she staring at, he added in an allusion to the daughter, whose eyes were fixed upon the face that now again looked out behind him. Don't mind her, lad, said the old woman, holding him closer to prevent his turning round. It's her way, her way. Tell me, Rob, did you ever see the lady, dearie? Oh, Mrs. Brown, what lady, cried the Grinder in a tone of piteous supplication. What lady? She retorted the lady, Mrs. Dumby. Yes, I believe I see her once, replied Rob. The night she went away, Robbie, eh? said the old woman in his ear, and taking note of every change in his face. I know it was that night. Well, if you know it was that night, you know, Mrs. Brown, replied Rob. It's no use putting pictures into a cove to make him say so. Where did they go that night, Rob? Straight away. How did they go? Where did you see her? Did she laugh? Did she cry? Tell me all about it," cried the old hag, holding him closer yet patting the hand that was drawn through his arm against her other hand and searching every line in his face. With her bleared eyes, "Come began, I want to be told all about it. What, Rob boy, you and me can keep a secret together, eh? We've done so before now. Where did they go first, Rob?" The wretched grinder made a gasp and a pause. "Are you dumb?" said the old woman angrily. "Lord, Mrs. Brown, no, you expect a cove to be a flash of lightning. I wish I was." The electric fluency muttered the bewildered grinder. "I'd have a shock at somebody. That would settle their business." "What do you say?" asked the old woman with a grin. "I'm wishing my love to you, Mrs. Brown," returned the false Rob, seeking consolation in the glass. "Where did they go to first? Was it him and her? Do you mean us?" said the old woman eagerly. "Them to? Well, they didn't go. No, we're not together. I mean," answered Rob. The old woman looked at him as though she had a strong impulse upon her to make another clutch at his head and throat, but was restrained by a certain dogged mystery in his face. "That was the art of it," said the reluctant grinder. "That's why nobody saw him go, or has been able to say how they did go. They went different ways, I tell you, Mrs. Brown. I made it an appointed place," chuckled the old woman after a moment's silent and keen scrutiny of his face. "Why, if they weren't going to meet somewhere, I suppose they might as well have stayed at home, might they?" Mrs. Brown returned the unwilling grinder. "Well, Rob, well," said the old woman, drawing his arm yet tighter through her own, as if in her eagerness she were afraid of his slipping away. "Well, haven't we talked enough yet, Mrs. Brown?" returned the grinder, who, between his sense of injury, his sense of liquor, and his sense of being on the rack, had become so lachrymose that at almost every answer he scooped his coat cuff into one or other of his eyes and uttered an unavailing whine of remonstrance. "Did she laugh that night? Was it? Didn't you ask if she laughed, Mrs. Brown?" I cried, added the old woman, nodding assent. "Neither," said the grinder. "She kept us steady when she and me. Oh, I see. You will have it out of me, Mrs. Brown. But take your solemn oath now that you'll never tell anybody this." Mrs. Brown very readily did, being naturally Jesuitical and having no other intention in the matter than that her concealed visitor should hear for himself. "She kept us steady then when she and me went down to Southampton," said the grinder as an image. "In the morning she was just the same, Mrs. Brown, and when she went away in the packet before daylight by herself, me pretending to be her servant and seeing her safe aboard, she was just the same. Now, are you contented, Mrs. Brown?" "No, Rob, not yet," answered Mrs. Brown decisively. "Oh, here's a woman for you," cried the unfortunate Rob in an outburst of feeble lamentation over his own helplessness. "What do you wish to know next, Mrs. Brown? What became of Master? Where did he go?" she inquired, still holding him tight and looking close into his face with her sharp eyes. "Upon my soul, I don't know, Mrs. Brown," answered Rob. "Upon my soul, I don't know what he did, nor where he went, nor anything about him. I only know what he said to me as a caution to own my tongue when we parted. But I tell you this, Mrs. Brown, as a friend, that sooner than ever repeat a word of what we're saying now, you would better take and shoot yourself or shut yourself up in this house and set it afire, for there's nothing he wouldn't do to be revenged upon you. You don't know him half as well as I do, Mrs. Brown. You'll never safe from him, I tell you." "Haven't I taken an oath?" retorted the old woman. "And won't I keep it? Well, I'm sure I hope you will, Mrs. Brown," returned Rob somewhat doubtfully, and not without a latent threatening in his manner. "For your own sake quite as much as mine." He looked at her as he gave her this friendly caution and emphasized it with a nodding of his head, but finding it uncomfortable to encounter the yellow face with its grotesque action and the ferret eyes with their keen old wintry gaze so close to his own, he looked down uneasily and sat sulking in his chair as if he were trying to bring himself to a sullen declaration that he would answer no more questions. The old woman, still holding him as before, took this opportunity of raising the forefinger of her right hand in the air as a stealthy signal to the concealed observer to give particular attention to what was about to follow. "Rob," she said in her most coaxing tone. "Good gracious, Mrs. Brown, what's the matter now?" returned the exasperated grinder. "Rob, where did the lady and Master appoint to meet?" Rob shuffled more and more and looked up and looked down and bit his thumb and dried it on his waistcoat and Finally said, eyeing his tormentor askant, "How should I know, Mrs. Brown?" The old woman held up her finger again, as before, and replying, "Come, lad, there's no use leading me to that. And they're leaving me, I want to know," waited for his answer. Rob, after a discomfited pause, suddenly broke out with, "How can I pronounce the names of foreign places, Mrs. Brown? What an unreasonable woman you are." "But you have heard it said, Robbie," she retorted firmly, "and you know what it sounded like." "Come, I never heard it said, Mrs. Brown," returned the grinder. Then retorted the old woman quickly, "You have seen it written, and you can spell it." Rob, with a petulant exclamation, between laughing and crying, for he was penetrated with some admiration of Mrs. Brown's cunning even through this persecution, after some reluctant fumbling in his waistcoat pocket, produced from it a little piece of chalk. The old woman's eyes sparkled when she saw it between his thumb and finger, and hastily clearing a space on the deal table that he might write the word there, she once more made her signal with a shaking hand. "Now I tell you beforehand what it is, Mrs. Brown," said Rob. "It's no use asking me anything else. I won't answer anything else. I can't. How long it was to me before they met, or whose plan it was that they was to go away alone, I don't know no more than you do. I don't know any more about it. If I was to tell you how I found out this word, you'd believe that." "Shall I tell you, Mrs. Brown?" "Yes, Rob." "Well then, Mrs. Brown, the way now, you won't ask any more, you know," said Rob, turning his eyes, which were now fast getting drowsy and stupid, upon her. "Not another word," said Mrs. Brown. "Well then, the way was this: when a certain person left the lady with me, he put a piece of paper with a direction written on it in the lady's hand, saying it was in case she should forget. She wasn't afraid of forgetting, for she tore it up as soon as his back was turned, and when I put up the carriage steps, I shook out one of the pieces. She sprinkled the rest out of the window, I suppose, for there was none there afterwards. Though I looked for him, there was only one word on it, and that was this: 'If you must and will know, but remember you're upon your oath, Mrs. Brown.'" Mrs. Brown knew that she said. Rob, having nothing more to say, began to chalk slowly and laboriously on the table. The old woman read aloud, when he had formed the letter. "Will you hold your tongue, Mrs. Brown?" he exclaimed, covering it with his hand and turning impatiently upon her. "I won't have it read out. Be quiet. Will you then write large?" "Rob," she returned, repeating a secret signal, "for my eyes are not good even at print," muttering to himself, and returning to his work with an ill will. Rob went on with the word as he bent his head down. The person for whose information he so unconsciously labored moved from the door behind him to within a short stride of his shoulder, and looked eagerly towards the creeping track of his hand upon the table. At the same time, Alice from her opposite chair watched it narrowly as it shaped the letters, and repeated each one on her lips as he made it without articulating it aloud. At the end of every letter her eyes and Mr. Dombey's met, as if each of them sought to be confirmed by the other, and thus they both spelt "DIJON." "There," said the grinder, moistening the palm of his hand hastily to obliterate the word, and not content with smearing it out, rubbing and planing all trace of it away with his coat sleeve until the very color of the chalk was gone from the table. "Now I hope you're contented, Mrs. Brown." The old woman, in token of her being so, released his arm and patted his back, and the grinder, overcome with mortification, cross-examination, and liquor, folded his arms on the table, laid his head upon them, and fell asleep. Not until he had been heavily asleep some time, and was snoring roundly, did the old woman turn towards the door where Mr. Dombey stood concealed, and beckon him to come through the room and pass out. Even then she hovered over Rob, ready to blind him with her hands, or strike his head down if he should raise it while the secret step was crossing to the door. But though her glance took sharp cognizance of the sleeper, it was sharper for the waking man, and when he touched her hand with his, and in spite of all his caution made a chinking golden sound, it was as bright and greedy as a raven's. The daughter's dark gaze followed him to the door, and noted well how pale he was, and how his hurried tread indicated that the least delay was an insupportable restraint upon him, and how he was burning to be active and away. As he closed the door behind him, she looked round at her mother. The old woman trotted to her, opened her hand to show what was within, and tightly closing it again in her jealousy and avarice, whispered, "What will he do, ally?" "Mischief," said the daughter. "Murder?" asked the old woman. "He's a madman in his wounded pride, and may do that for anything we can say, or he either. Her glance was brighter than her mother's, and the fire that shone in it was fiercer, but her face was colorless even to her lips. They said no more, but sat apart, the mother communing with her money, the daughter with her thoughts, the glance of each shining in the gloom of the feebly lighted room. Rob slept and snored. The disregarded parrot only was in action. It twisted and pulled at the wires of its cage with its crooked beak and crawled up to the dome and along its roof like a fly and down again head foremost, and shook and bit and rattled at every slender bar as if it knew its master's danger and was wild to force a passage out and fly away to warn him of it. Chapter 53. More intelligence. There were two of the traitor's own blood, his renounced brother and sister, on whom the weight of his guilt rested almost more heavily at this time than on the man whom he had so deeply injured, prying and tormenting as the world was. It did Mr. Dobby the service of nerving him to pursuit and revenge. It roused his passion, stung his pride, twisted the one idea of his life into a new shape, and made some gratification of his wrath the object into which his whole intellectual existence resolved itself. All the stubbornness and implacability of his nature, all its hard impenetrable quality, all its gloom and moroseness, all its exaggerated sense of personal importance, all its jealous disposition to resent the least flaw, and the ample recognition of his importance by others, set this way like many streams united into one, and bore him on upon their tide. The most impetuously passionate and violently impulsive of mankind would have been a milder enemy to encounter than the sullen Mr. Dombey wrought to. This a wild beast would have been easier turned or soothed than the grave gentleman without a wrinkle in his starched cravat. But this very intensity of his purpose became almost a substitute for action in it. While he was yet uninformed of the traitor's retreat, it served to divert his mind from his own calamity and to entertain it with another prospect. The brother and sister of his false favorite had no such relief. Everything in their history, past and present, gave his delinquency a more afflicting meaning to them. The sister may have sometimes sadly thought that if she had remained with him, the companion and friend she had been once, he might have escaped the crime into which he had fallen. If she ever thought so, it was still without regret for what she had done, without the least doubt of her duty, without any pricing or enhancing of her self-devotion. But when this possibility presented itself to the erring and repentant brother, as it sometimes did, it smote upon his heart with such a keen reproachful touch as he could hardly bear. No idea of retort upon his cruel brother came into his mind, a new accusation of himself, fresh inward lamentings over his own unworthiness, and the ruin in which it was at once his consolation and his self-reproach that he did not stand alone were the sole kind of reflections to which the discovery gave rise in him. It was on the very same day whose evening set upon the last chapter, and when Mr. Dombey's world was busiest with the elopement of his wife, that the window of the room in which the brother and sister sat at their early breakfast was darkened by the unexpected shadow of a man coming to the little porch. Which man was Perch the messenger. "I've stepped over from Ball's Pond at an early hour," said Mr. Perch confidentially, looking in at the room door and stopping on the mat to wipe his shoes all round, which had no mud upon them agreeable to my instructions last night. They was to be sure and bring a note to you, Mr. Cargo, before you went out in the morning. "I should have been here a good hour and a half ago," said Mr. Perch meekly, "but for the state of health of Mrs. P, who I thought I should have lost in the night, I do assure you 5 distinct times." "Is your wife so?" asked Harriet. "Why, you see," said Mr. Perch, first turning round to shut the door carefully, "she takes what has happened in our house so much to heart. Miss, her nerves is so very delicate, you see, and soon unstrung not, but what the strongest nerves had good need to be shook. I'm sure you feel it very much yourself." "No doubts." Harriet repressed a sigh and glanced at her brother. "I'm sure I feel it myself in my humble way," Mr. Perch went on to say, with a shake of his head in a manner I couldn't have believed if I hadn't been called upon to undergo it. "Has almost the effect of drink upon me. I literally feels every Mourning as if I'd been taking more than was good for me overnight. Mr. Percher's appearance corroborated this recital of his symptoms. There was an air of feverish lassitude about it that seemed referable to drams, and which in fact might, no doubt, have been traced to those numerous discoveries of himself in the bars of public houses being treated and questioned, which he was in the daily habit of making. Therefore I can judge, said Mr. Perch, shaking his head and speaking in a silvery murmur of the feelings of such as is at all peculiarly situated in this most painful revelation. Here Mr. Perch waited to be confided in, and receiving no confidence coughed behind his hand. This leading to nothing, he coughed behind his hat, and that leading to nothing, he put his hat on the ground and sought in his breast pocket for the letter. If I rightly recollect, there was no answer, said Mr. Perch with an affable smile, but perhaps you'd be so good as cast your eye over it. Sir John Carker broke the seal, which was Mr. Dobby's, and possessing himself of the contents, which were very brief, replied, No answer is expected. Then I shall wish you good morning, miss, said Perch, taking a step towards the door, and hoping I'm sure that you'll not permit yourself to be more reduced in mind than you can help by the late painful revelation. The papers, said Mr. Perch, taking 2 steps back again, and comprehensively addressing both the brother and sister in a whisper of increased mystery, is more eager for news of it than you'd suppose possible. One of the Sunday ones, in a blue cloak and a white hat, that had previously offered for to bribe me, need I say, with what success, was dodging about our court last night, as late as 20 minutes. After 8 o'clock I see him myself with his eye at the counting-house keyhole, which being patent is impervious. Another one, said Mr. Perch, with military frogs, is in the parlor of the King's Arms. All a blessed day I happened last week to let a little observation fall there, and next morning, which was Sunday, I see it worked up in print in a most surprising manner. Mr. Perch resorted to his breast pocket as if to produce the paragraph, but receiving no encouragement, pulled out his beaver gloves, picked up his hat, and took his leave. And before it was high noon, Mr. Perch had related to several select audiences at the King's Arms and elsewhere how Miss Carrara, bursting into tears, had caught him by both hands and said, Oh dear, dear Perch, the sight of you is all the comfort I have left. And how Mr. John Carrara had said in an awful voice, Urge I disown him, never let me hear him mentioned as a brother more. Dear John, said Harriet when they were left alone, and had remained silent for some moments, there are bad tidings in that letter. Yes, but nothing unexpected, he replied. I saw the writer yesterday, the writer Mr. Dombey. He passed twice through the counting-house while I was there. I had been able to avoid him before, but of course could not hope to do that long. I know how natural it was that he should regard my presence as something offensive. I felt it must be so myself. He did not say so, no, he said nothing, but I saw that his glance rested on me for a moment, and I was prepared for what would happen. For what has happened, I am dismissed. She looked as little shocked and as hopeful as she could. But it was distressing news for many reasons. I need not tell you, said John Parker, reading the letter, why your name would henceforth have an unnatural sound in however remote a connection with mine, or why the daily sight of anyone who bears it would be unendurable to me. I have to notify the cessation of all engagements between us from this date, and to request that no renewal of any communication with me or my establishment be ever attempted by you. Enclosed is an equivalent in money to a generously long notice, and this is my discharge, heaven knows. Harriet, it is a lenient and considerate one, when we remember all, if it be lenient and considerate to punish you at all. John, for the misdeed of another, she replied gently. Yes, we have been an ill omen trace to him, said John Cocker. He has reason to shrink from the sound of our name, and to think that there is something cursed and wicked in our blood. I should almost think it to Harriet, but for you. Brother, don't speak like this. If you have any special reason, as you say you have, and think you have, though I say no, to love me, spare me the hearing of such wild, mad words. He covered his face with both his hands, but soon permitted her coming near him to take one in her own. After so many years, this parting is a melancholy thing, I know, said his sister, and the cause of it is dreadful to us. Both we have to live too, and must look about us for the means. Well, we can do so. Undismayed, it is our pride, not our trouble, to strive, John, and to strive together. A smile played on her lips as she kissed his cheek and entreated him to be of good cheer. "O dearest sister, tired of your own noble will to a ruined man whose reputation is blighted, who is no friend himself, and has driven every friend of yours away, John," she said. She laid her hand hastily upon his lips. "For my sake, in remembrance of our long companionship." He was silent now, let me tell you. Dear, quietly sitting by his side, I have, as you have expected this. And when I have been thinking of it, and fearing it would happen, and preparing myself for it as well as I could, I have resolved to tell you, if it should be so that I have kept a secret from you, and that we have a friend. "What's our friend's name?" "Harriet," he answered with a sorrowful smile. "Indeed, I don't know, but he once made a very earnest protestation to me of his friendship and his wish to serve us and to this day I believe him." Harriet exclaimed, her wondering brother, "Where does this friend live?" "Neither do I know that," she returned. "But he knows us both, and our history, all our little history, John. That is the reason why, at his own suggestion, I have kept the secret of his coming here from you, lest his acquaintance with it should distress you. Here he has been here, Harriet, here in this room. Once what kind of man? Not young, gray-headed, as he said, and fast growing grayer, but generous and frank and good, I am sure, and only seen once, Harriet, in this room. Only once," said his sister with the slightest and most transient glow upon her cheek. "But when here he entreated me to suffer to see him once a week as he passed by, in token of our being well, and continuing to need nothing at his hands. For I told him, when he proffered us any service he could render, which was the object of his visit, that we needed nothing, and once a week, once every week since then, and always on the same day, and at the same hour, he has gone past, always on foot, always going in the same direction towards London, and never pausing longer than to bow to me, and to wave his hand cheerfully, as a kind guardian might. He made that promise when he proposed these curious interviews, and has kept it so faithfully and pleasantly, that if I ever felt any trifling uneasiness about them in the beginning, which I don't think I did, John, his manner was so plain and true, it very soon vanished, and left me quite glad when the day it was coming. Last Monday, the first since this terrible event, he did not go by, and I have wondered whether his absence can have been in any way connected with what has happened." "How?" inquired her brother. "I don't know how. I have only speculated on the coincidence. I have not tried to account for it. I feel sure he will return. When he does, dear John, let me tell him that I have at last spoken to you, and let me bring you to together. He will certainly help us to a new livelihood." His entreaty was that he might do something to smooth my life and yours, and I gave him my promise that if we ever wanted a friend I would remember him. Then his name was to be no secret, Harriet said. Her brother, who had listened with close attention, described this gentleman to me. "I surely ought to know one who knows me so well." His sister painted as vividly as she could the features, stature, and dress of her visitor. But John Carker, either from having no knowledge of the original, or from some fault in her description, or from some abstraction of his thoughts as he walked to and fro pondering, could not recognize the portrait she presented to him. However, it was agreed between them that he should see the original when he next appeared. This concluded, the sister applied herself with a less anxious breast to her domestic occupations, and the gray-haired man, late junior of Dom's, devoted the first day of his unwanted liberty to working in the garden. It was quite late at night, and the brother was reading aloud while the sister plied her needle, when they were interrupted by a knocking at the door. In the atmosphere of vague anxiety and dread that lowered about them in connection with their fugitive brother, this sound, unusual there, became almost alarming. The brother going to the door, the sister sat and listened timidly. Someone spoke to him, and he replied and seemed surprised, and after a few words, the two approached together. "Hurry," it said, her brother lighting in their late visitor and speaking in a low voice. "Mr. Morphine, the gentleman's so long in Dobby's house with James." His sister started back as if a ghost had entered. In the doorway stood the unknown friend, with the dark hair sprinkled with gray, the ruddy face, the broad clear brow, and hazel eyes, whose secret she had kept so long. "John," she said half breathlessly, "it is the gentleman I told you of today." "The gentleman," Miss Harriet said, the visitor coming in, for he had stopped a moment in the doorway, "is greatly relieved to hear you say that he has been devising ways and means all the way here of explaining himself. and has been satisfied with none. Mr. John, I'm not quite a stranger here. You were stricken with astonishment when you saw me at your door. Just now I observe you are most astonished at present. Well, that's reasonable enough under existing circumstances. If we were not such creatures of habit as we are, we shouldn't have reason to be astonished half so often. By this time, he had greeted Harriet with that able mingling of cordiality and respect which he recollected so well, and had sat down near her, pulled off his gloves, and thrown them into his hat upon the table. There's nothing astonishing, he said, in my having conceived a desire to see your sister, Mr. John, or in my having gratified it in my own way. As to the regularity of my visits, since which she may have mentioned to you, there is nothing extraordinary in that they soon grew into a habit, and we are creatures of habit. Putting his hands into his pockets and leaning back in his chair, he looked at the brother and sister as if it were interesting to him to see them together, and went on to say with a kind of irritable thoughtfulness, "It's this same habit that confirms some of us who are capable of better things in Lucifer's own pride and stubbornness, that confirms and deepens others of us in villainy, more of us in indifference, that hardens us from day to day according to the temper of our clay like images, and leaves us susceptible as images to new impressions and convictions. You shall judge of its influence on me, John. For more years than I need name, I had my small and exactly defined share in the management of Dobby's house, and saw your brother, who has proved himself a scoundrel. Your sister will forgive my being obliged to mention it, extending his influence until the business and its owner were his football, and saw you toiling at your obscure desk every day, and was quite content to be as little troubled as I might be out of my own strip of duty, and to let everything about me go on day by day unquestioned like a great machine. That was its habit and mine, and to take it all for granted and consider it all right. My Wednesday nights came regularly round, our quartet parties came regularly off, my violoncello was in good tune, and there was nothing wrong in my world, or if anything, not much or little or much, it was no affair of mine. I can answer for your being more respected and beloved during all that time than anybody in the house, sir, said John Cockapoo, good-natured and easy enough, I dare say, returned the other. A habit I had. It suited the manager, it suited the man he managed, it suited me best. Of all I did what was allotted to me to do, made no court to either of them, and was glad to occupy a station in which none was required. So I should have gone on till now, but that my room had a thin wall. You can tell your sister that it was divided from the manager's room by a wainslet partition. They were adjoining rooms, had been one perhaps originally, and were separated, as Mr. Morphin says, said her brother, looking back to him for the resumption of his explanation. I have whistled hum tunes, gone accurately through the whole of Beethoven's Sonata in B to let him know that I was within hearing, said Mr. Morphin. But he never heeded me. It happened seldom enough that I was within hearing of anything of a private nature, certainly. But when I was and couldn't otherwise avoid knowing something of it, I walked out once, John, during a conversation between two brothers, to which in the beginning young Walter Gay was a party, but I overheard some of it before I left the room. You remember it sufficiently perhaps to tell your sister what its nature was. It referred, Harriet said, her brother, in a low voice, to the past, and to our relative positions in the house. Its matter was not new to me, but was presented in a new aspect. It shook me in my habit, the habit of 9/10 of the world, of believing that all was right about me, because I was used to it, said the visitor, and induced me to recall the history of the two brothers, and to ponder on it. I think it was almost the first time in my life when I fell into this train of reflection. How will many things that are familiar and quite matters of course to us now look when we come to see them from that new and distant point of view which we must all take up one day or other. I was something less good-natured, as the phrase goes, after that morning, less easy and complacent altogether. He sat for a minute or so drumming with one hand on the table and resumed in a hurry, as if he were anxious to get rid of his confession. Before I knew what to do, or whether I could do anything, there was a second conversation between the same two brothers, in which their sister was mentioned. I had no scruples of conscience in suffering all the waves and strays of that conversation to float to me as freely as they would. I considered them mine, By right after that I came here to see the sister for myself the first time I stopped. At the garden gate I made a pretext of inquiring into the character of a poor neighbor, but I wandered out of that tract, and I think Miss Harriet mistrusted me the second time I asked leave to come and came in, and said what I wished to say. Your sister showed me reasons, which I dared not dispute, for receiving no assistance from me then, but I established a means of communication between us which remained unbroken until within these few days, when I was prevented by important matters that have lately devolved upon me from maintaining them. How little I have suspected this, said John Cocker, when I have seen you every day, sir. If Harriet could have guessed your name. Why, to tell you the truth, John, interposed the visitor, I kept it to myself for two reasons. I don't know that the first might have been binding alone, but one has no business to take credit for good intentions, and I made up my mind at all events not to disclose myself until I should be able to do you some real service or other. My second reason was that I always hoped there might be some lingering possibility of your brother's relenting towards you both, and in that case, I felt that where there was the chance of a man of his suspicious, watchful character discovering that you had been secretly befriended by me, there was the chance of a new and fatal cause of division. I resolved to be sure, at the risk of turning his displeasure against myself, which would have been no matter, to watch my opportunity of serving you with the head of the house. But the distractions of death, courtship, marriage, and domestic unhappiness have left us no head but your brother for this long time, and it would have been better for us, said the visitor, dropping his voice to have been a lifeless trunk. He seemed conscious that these latter words had escaped him against his will, and stretching out a hand to the brother and a hand to the sister, continued, all I could desire to say, and more I have now said. All I mean goes beyond words, as I hope you understand and believe. The time has come, John, though most unfortunately and unhappily come, when I may help you, without interfering with that redeeming struggle which has lasted through so many years since you were discharged from it today by no act of your own. It is late, I need say no more tonight. You will guard the treasure you have here, without advice or reminder from me. With these words he rose to go. But go you first, John, he said good-humoredly, with a light, without saying what you want to say, whatever that may be. John Carker's heart was full, and he would have relieved it in speech if he could. And let me have a word with your sister. We have talked alone before, and in this room, though it looks more natural with you here. Following him out with his eyes, he turned kindly to Harriet and said in a lower voice and with an altered and graver manner, you wish to ask me something of the man whose sister it is your misfortune to be. I dread to ask, said Harriet. You have looked so earnestly at me more than once, rejoined the visitor, that I think I can divine your question. Has he taken money, is it? That yes, he has not, I thank heaven, said Harriet, for the sake of John. That he has abused his trust in many ways, said Mr. Morphin. That he has often dealt and speculated to advantage for himself than for the house he represented. That he has led the house on to prodigious ventures, often resulting in enormous losses. That he has always pampered the vanity and ambition of his employer, when it was his duty to have held them in check and shown, as it was in his power to do, to what they tended here. Or there will not perhaps surprise you now undertakings have been entered on to swell the reputation of the house for vast resources, and to exhibit it in magnificent contrast to other merchants' houses, of which it requires a steady head to contemplate. The possibly a few disastrous changes of affairs might render them the probably ruinous consequences in the midst of the many transactions of the house in most parts of the world, a great labyrinth of which only he has held the clue. He has had the opportunity, and he seems to have used it, of keeping the various results afloat when ascertained, and substituting estimates and generalities for facts. But latterly, you follow me, Miss Harriet? Perfectly, she answered, with her frightened face fixed on his. Pray tell me all the worst at once. Latterly, he appears to have devoted the greatest pains to making these results so plain and clear that reference to the private books enables one to grasp them, numerous and varying as they are, with extraordinary ease, as if he had resolved to show his employer at one broad view what has been brought upon him by ministration to his ruling passion, that it has been his constant practice to minister to that passion basely, and to flatter it corruptly is indubitable in that his criminality, as it is connected with the affairs of the house, chiefly consists one other word. Before you leave me, dear sir, said Harriet, there's no danger in all this. How danger? He returned with a little hesitation. To the credit of the house, I cannot help answering you plainly and trusting you completely, said Mr. Morphin, after a moment's survey of her face. You may indeed, you may. I am sure I may. Danger to the house's credit? No, none. There may be a difficulty, greater or less difficulty, but no danger unless indeed the head of the house, unable to bring his mind to the reduction of its enterprises, and positively refusing to believe that it is or can be in any position but the position in which he has always represented it to himself, should urge it beyond its strength, then it would totter. But there is no apprehension of that, said Harriet. There shall be no half-confidence, he replied, shaking her hand. Between us, Mr. Dombey is unapproachable by anyone, and his state of mind is haughty, rash, unreasonable, and ungovernable now. But he is disturbed and agitated now beyond all common bounds, and it may pass. You now know all, both worst and best. No more tonight, and good night. With that he kissed her hand, and passing out to the door where her brother stood awaiting his coming, put him cheerfully aside. When he essayed to speak, told him that as they would see each other soon, and often, he might speak at another time if he would. But there was no leisure for it then, and went away at a round pace in order that no word of gratitude might follow him. The brother and sister sat conversing by the fireside until it was almost day, made sleepless by this glimpse of the new world that opened before them, and feeling like to people shipwrecked long ago upon a solitary coast, to whom a ship had come at last when they were old in resignation, and had lost all thought of any other home. But another and different kind of disquietude kept them waking to the darkness out of which this light had broken on them, gathered around, and the shadow of their guilty brother was in the house where his foot had never trod, nor was it to be driven out, nor did it fade before the sun next morning. It was there at noon, at night, darkest and most distinct at night, as is now to be told. John Carr had gone out in pursuance of a letter of appointment from their friend, and Harriet was left in the house alone. She had been alone some hours. A dull, grave evening and a deepening twilight were not favorable to the removal of the oppression on her spirits. The idea of this brother, long unseen and unknown, flitted about her in frightful shapes. He was dead, dying, calling to her, staring at her, frowning on her. The pictures in her mind were so obtrusive and exact that as the twilight deepened, she dreaded to raise her head and look at the dark corners of the room, lest his wraith, the offspring of her excited imagination, should be waiting there to startle her. Once she had such a fancy of his being in the next room, hiding, though she knew quite well what a distempered fancy it was, and had no belief in it, that she forced herself to go there for her own conviction. But in vain. The room resumed its shadowy terrors the moment she left it, and she had no more power to divest herself of these vague impressions of dread than if they had been stone giants rooted in the solid earth. It was almost dark, and she was sitting near the window, with her head upon her hand, looking down, when, sensible of a sudden increase in the gloom of the apartment, she raised her eyes and uttered an involuntary cry close to the glass. A pale, scared face gazed in vacantly for an instant, as searching for an object. Then the eyes rested on herself and lighted up. Let me in, I want to speak to you. And the hand rattled on the glass. She recognized immediately the woman with the long dark hair, to whom she had given warmth, food, and shelter one wet night. Naturally afraid of her, remembering her violent behavior, Harriet, retreating a little from the window, stood undecided and alarmed. Let me in, let me speak to you. I am thankful, quiet, humble, anything you like, but let me speak to you. The vehemence of the entreaty, the earnest expression of the face, the trembling of the two hands that were raised imploringly, a certain dread and terror in the voice akin to her own condition, at the moment prevailed with Harriet. She hastened to the door and opened it. May I come in, or shall I speak here? Said the woman, catching at her hand. What is it that you want? What is it that you have to say? Not much, but let me say it out, or I shall never say it. I'm tempted now to go away. There seem to be hands dragging me from the door. Let me come in, if you can trust me for this once. Her energy again prevailed, and they passed into the firelight of the little kitchen, where she had before sat and ate and dried her clothes. Sit there, said Alice, kneeling down beside her, and look at me. You remember me? Do you remember what I told you I had been, and where I came from, ragged and lame, with the fierce wind and weather beating on my head? Yes, you know how I came back that night and threw your money in the dirt and cursed you in your race. Now see me here upon my knees. Am I less earnest now than I was then? If what you ask, said Harriet gently, is forgiveness, but it's not, returned the other with a proud fierce look. What I ask is to be believed. Now you shall judge if I'm worthy of belief, both as I was and as I am still. Upon her knees, and with her eyes upon the fire, and the fire shining on her ruined beauty, and her wild black hair, one long tress of which she pulled over her shoulder and wound about her hand, and thoughtfully bit and tore. While speaking she went on, when I was young and pretty, and this plucking contemptuously at the hair she held was only handled delicately, and couldn't be admired enough. My mother, who had not been very mindful of me as a child, found out my merits, and was fond of me and proud of me. She was covered to some poor, and thought to make a sort of property of me. No great lady ever thought that of a daughter, yet I'm sure acted as if she did. It's never done, we all know, and that shows that the only instances of mothers bringing up their daughters wrong and evil coming out of it are among such miserable folks as us. Looking at the fire, as if she were forgetful for the moment of having any auditor, she continued in a dreamy way as she wound the long tress of hair tight round and round her hand. What came of that I needn't say. Wretched marriages don't come of such things. In our degree only wretchedness and ruin came on me. Raising her eyes swiftly from their moody gaze upon the fire to Harriet's face, she said, I'm wasting time, and there is none to spare yet. If I hadn't thought of all, I shouldn't be here now. Wretchedness and ruin came on me. I say I was made a short-lived toy and flung aside more cruelly and carelessly than even such things are. By whose hand do you think? Why do you ask me? Said Harriet. Why do you tremble? Rejoined Alice with an eager look. His usage made a devil of me. I sunk in wretchedness and ruin lower and lower, yet I was concerned in a robbery in every part of it, but the gang, and was found out and sent to be trodden without a friend, without a penny. Though I was but a girl, I would have gone to death sooner than ask him for a word. If a word of his could have saved me, I would to any death that could have been invented. But my mother, covered as always, sent him in my name, told the true story of my case, and humbly prayed and petitioned for a small last gift, for not so many pounds as I have fingers on this hand. Who was it, do you think, who snapped his fingers at me in my misery, lying as he believed at his feet, and left me without even this poor sign of remembrance, well satisfied that I should be sent abroad beyond the reach of farther trouble to him, and should die and rot there? Who was this, do you think? Why do you ask me? Repeated Harriet. Why do you tremble? Said Alice, laying her hand upon her arm and looking in her face. But that the answer is on your lips. It was your brother James. Harriet trembled more and more, but did not avert her eyes from the eager look that rested on them. When I knew you were his sister, which was on that night I came back weary and lame to spurn your gift, I felt that night as if I could have traveled weary and lame over the whole world to stab him, if I could have found him in a lonely place with no one near. Do you believe that I was earnest in all that I do? Good heaven, why are you come again since then? Said Alice with the same grasp of her arm and the same look in her face. I have seen him, I have followed him with my eyes in the broad day. If any spark of my resentment slumbered in my bosom, it sprung into a blaze when my eyes rested on him. You know he has wronged a proud man and made him his deadly enemy. What if I had given information of him to that man? Information, repeated Harriet. What if I had found out one who knew your brother's secret, who knew the manner of his flight, who knew where he and the companion of his flight were gone? What if I had made him utter all his knowledge word by word, before his enemy concealed to hear it? What if I had sat by at the time, looking into this enemy's face, and seeing it change till it was scarcely human? What if I had seen him rush away mad in pursuit? What if I knew now that he was on his road, more fiend than man, and must in so many hours come up with him? Remove your hand, said Harriet, recoiling. Go away, your touch is dreadful to me. I have done this, pursued the other with her eager look. Regardless of the interruption, do I Speak and look as if I really had. Do you believe what I am saying? I fear I must let my arm go. Not yet a moment more. You can think what my revengeful purpose must have been to last so long and urge me to do this dreadful, said Harriet then. When you see me, no, said Alice hoarsely, here again, kneeling quietly on the ground, with my touch upon your arm, with my eyes upon your face, you may believe that there is no common earnestness in what I say, and that no common struggle has been. Battling in my breast, I am ashamed to speak the words, but I relent. I despise myself. I have fought with myself all day and all last night, but I relent towards him without reason, and wish to repair what I have done. If it is possible, I wouldn't have them come together while his pursuer is so blind and headlong. If you had seen him as he went out last night, you would know the danger better. How shall it be prevented? What can I do? Cried Harriet. All night long, pursued the other hurriedly. I had dreams of him, and yet I didn't sleep in his blood all day. I have had him near me. What can I do? Cried Harriet, shuddering at these words. If there is anyone who will write or send or go to him, let them lose no time. He is at Dijon. Do you know the name and where it is? Yes. Warn him that the man he has made his enemy is in a frenzy, and that he doesn't know him. If he makes light of his approach, tell him that he is on the road. I know he is, and hurrying on, urge him to get away while there is time. If there is time, and not to meet him yet a month or so will make years of difference. Let them not encounter through me anywhere, but there any time. But now let his foe follow him and find him for himself, but not through me. There is enough upon my head. Without the fire ceased to be reflected in her jet black hair, uplifted face, and eager eyes. Her hand was gone from Harriet's arm, and the place where she had been was empty. Chapter 54. The fugitives' tea time, an hour short of midnight. The place, a French apartment comprising some half-dozen rooms, a dull cold hall or corridor, a dining room, a drawing room, a bedroom, and an inner drawing room or boudoir, smaller and more retired than the rest, all these shut in by one large pair of doors on the main staircase, but each room provided with 2 or 3 pairs of doors of its own, establishing several means of communication with the remaining portion of the apartment, or with certain small passages within the wall leading, as is not unusual in such houses, to some back stairs with an obscure outlet below the whole, situated on the first floor of so large an hotel that it did not absorb one entire row of windows upon one side of the square courtyard in the center, upon which the whole 4 sides of the mansion looked an air of splendor sufficiently faded to be melancholy, and sufficiently dazzling to clog and embarrass the details of life with a show of state. Reigned in these rooms. The walls and ceilings were gilded and painted. The floors were waxed and polished. Crimson drapery hung in festoons from window, door, and mirror, and candelabra, gnarled and intertwisted like the branches of trees or horns of animals, stuck out from the panels of the walls. But in the daytime, when the lattice blinds, now closely shut, were opened, and the light let in, traces were discernible among this finery of wear and tear, and dust of sun, and damp and smoke, and lengthened intervals of want of use and habitation, when such shows and toys of life seem sensitive like life and waste, as men shut up in prison do. Even night and clusters of burning candles could not wholly efface them, though the general glitter through them, and the shade, the glitter of bright tapers, and their reflection in looking glasses, scraps of gilding and gay colors, were confined on this night to one room, that smaller room within the rest just now enumerated. Seen from the hall, where a lamp was feebly burning through the dark perspective of open doors, it looked as shining and precious as a gem. In the heart of its radiance sat a beautiful woman, Edith. She was alone, the same defiant, scornful woman still, the cheek a little worn, the eye a little larger in appearance and more lustrous, but the haughty bearing just the same. No shame upon her brow, no late repentance, bending her disdainful neck, imperious and stately yet, and yet regardless of herself and of all else. She sat with her dark eyes cast down, waiting for someone. No book, no work, no occupation of any kind, but her own thought beguiled the tardy time. Some purpose strong enough to fill up any pause possessed her. With her lips pressed together and quivering, if for a moment she released them from her control, with her nostril inflated, her hands clasped in one another, and her purpose swelling in her breast, she sat and waited at the sound of a key in the outer door and a footstep in the hall. She started up and cried, "Who's that?" The answer was in French, and 2 men came in with jingling trays. to make preparation for supper, who had bade them to do so. She asked Monsieur had commanded it. When it was his pleasure to take the apartment, Monsieur had said, when he stayed there for an hour en route and left the letter for Madame had received it. Surely yes, 1,000 pardons. The sudden apprehension that it might have been forgotten had struck him. A bald man with a large beard from a neighboring restaurant. With despair, Monsieur had said that supper was to be ready at that hour, also that he had forewarned Madame of the commands he had given in his letter. Monsieur had done the golden head the honor to request that the supper should be choice and delicate. Monsieur would find that his confidence in the golden head was not misplaced. Edith said no more, but looked on thoughtfully while they prepared the table for 2 persons and set the wine upon it. She rose before they had finished, and taking a lamp passed into the bedchamber and into the drawing room, where she hurriedly but narrowly examined all the doors, particularly one in the former room that opened on the passage in the wall. From this she took the key and put it on the outer side. She then came back. The men, the second of whom was a dark bilious subject in a jacket close shaved and with a black head of hair close cropped, had completed their preparation of the table and were standing looking at it. He who had spoken before inquired whether Madame thought it would be long before Monsieur arrived. She couldn't say, it was all one pardon there was. The supper, it should be eaten on the instant. Monsieur, who spoke French like an angel or a Frenchman, it was all the same, had spoken with great emphasis of his punctuality. But the English nation had so grand a genius for punctuality. Ah, what noise, great heaven! Here was Monsieur. Behold him, in effect. Monsieur, admitted by the other of the two, came with his gleaming teeth through the dark rooms like a mouth, and arriving in that sanctuary of light and color, a figure at full length, embraced Madame and addressed her in the French tongue as his charming wife. My God, Madame is going to faint. Madame is overcome with joy. The bald man with a beard observed it and cried out. Madame had only shrunk and shivered before the words were spoken. She was standing with her hand upon the velvet back of a great chair, her figure drawn up to its full height, and her face immovable. Francois has flown over to the golden head for supper. He flies on these occasions like an angel or a bird. The baggage of Monsieur is in his room. All is arranged. The supper will be here this moment. These facts the bald man notified with bows and smiles, and presently the supper came. The hot dishes were on a chafing dish, the cold already set forth with the change of service on a sideboard. Monsieur was satisfied with this arrangement. The supper table being small, it pleased him very well. Let them set the chafing dish upon the floor, and go he would remove the dishes with his own hands. Pardon, said the bold man politely. It was impossible. Monsieur was of another opinion. He required no further attendance that night. But Madame, the bold man hinted. Madame replied Monsieur had her own maid. It was enough. 1,000,000 pardons. No, Madame had no maid. I came here alone, said Edith. It was my choice to do so. I am well used to traveling. I want no attendance. They need send nobody to me. Monsieur accordingly, persevering in his first proposed impossibility, proceeded to follow the 2 attendants to the outer door and secure it after them for the night. The bald man, turning round to bow as he went out, observed that Madame still stood with her hand upon the velvet back of the great chair, and that her face was quite regardless of him, though she was looking straight before her, as the sound of Cacau's fastening the door resounded through the intermediate rooms, and seemed to come hushed and stilled into that last distant one. The sound of the cathedral clock striking 12 mingled with it in Edith's ears. She heard him pause as if he heard it too, and listened, and then came back towards her, laying a long train of footsteps through the silence and shutting all the doors behind him. As he came along, her hand for a moment left the velvet chair to bring a knife within her reach upon the table. Then she stood as she had stood before. How strange to come here by yourself, my love, he said as he entered. What she returned, her tone was so harsh, the quick turn of her head so fierce, her attitude so repellent, and her frown so black, that he stood with the lamp in his hand, looking at her as if she had struck him motionless. I say, he at length repeated, putting down the lamp and smiling his most courtly smile, how strange to come here alone. It was unnecessary caution surely, and might have defeated itself. You were to have engaged an attendant at Havre or Rouen, and have had abundance Of time for the purpose, though you had been the most capricious and difficult as you are the most beautiful, my love of women.